If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this.
What otherworldly phenomena experience, like strange portals in the woods, orbs, UFOs, abductions, time slips, reality rifts, mysterious stares in the forest, glitches, etc., have you witnessed?
I lost 5 hours of my life. I used to work at a coffee shop. I opened the shop and worked from 5 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. I watched the clock like a hawk to get off and left at 10:30 on the dot. Since I lived only 5 minutes away, I returned home, let my dog out, and quickly used my own bathroom before heading to the store. It could have only been 10:45 a.m. at the latest at the time I left my house for the store. When I got to the store, I checked my phone, and it was 3:32 p.m. About 5 hours of my life had just disappeared. I double-checked the time on my phone, and it was correct. I assumed my phone was wrong, so I didn't think anything of it. Got my shit and went home. The clock on the microwave read 3:48. I couldn't believe it, so I checked my laptop, stove, and iPad, and it was 3:48. I was getting a bit freaked out and called a friend to ask them what time it was, and they confirmed it was, by that time, 3:50 p.m. I told my friend what happened, and they thought maybe I misremembered what time I had worked. But I had opened the store at 5 a.m. alone, starting all the coffee and tea. Those aren't normal tasks you can mix up with the tasks you do on another shift. I then texted a coworker to send me a photo of our schedule, and it confirmed I had worked from 5 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. Is there a term for this specific phenomenon of losing large chunks of time? It's so strange and unnerving. I wonder where I was or what happened in the world during those lost 5 hours. I wonder if anyone else lost the same 5 hours I did. I think I saw a portal opening when I was 14. Hello. I wonder if anyone has seen or heard of anything similar to what I'm about to describe. When I was 14, 20 now, I was sitting in the basement of our old house with my sister, who was 16 at the time. The basement was massive, maybe 5 meters from the entrance to the back wall and like 2 to 3 meters wide. We were sitting on a bed at the back wall just talking, and I happened to be looking at the entrance when suddenly, next to it, a kind of ball of light/electricity appeared that stretched to the floor and ceiling. It made a very weird, high-pitched sound that got higher and higher, and then it suddenly disappeared. It looked like some sort of portal opening, and it was a very bright white color. My sister was extremely frightened and asked me if I saw it too. I did, and almost right after it was gone, I went to the spot it was to check if it left any marks or anything behind. It didn't. There were no ceiling lamps or anything near it, so I don't think it was some kind of electricity. And it didn't appear up from the floor or down from the ceiling. It appeared in midair and then stretched to the floor and ceiling. It was a sunny summer day, and there had not been any thunderstorms recently when it happened. If I had been alone when I saw it, I would have thought I imagined it, but my sister saw it too. A couple of months before this, our mom fell down the stairs leading down to the basement and passed away at the basement entrance. I don't know if that is relevant, but I thought I'd mention it. I have tried researching to see if anyone else has experienced something similar, but I haven't found anything. It also didn't match the description of ball lightning. I still often think about the event even though it's been many years since this happened. Please comment on your theories about what it could have been if you have experienced something similar. Does anyone know anything about spirit portals? My fiancée and I are going to visit her aunt to see about a portal she claims to have above her bed. She states that during the day it looks like perfectly painted drywall above her bed, but at night, according to several eyewitness testimonies, the drywall spot begins to take on a portal-like appearance. She claims that the spot will begin to start rippling like waves, and when you look at it, it appears to have stars beyond the portal. When I asked about the ripple, they stated, it looks as though it's breathing. I've tried Googling it and asking friends, and it seems like no one has ever experienced anything quite like it. I am a very big skeptic on things like this, but after hearing several different stories from different people, I've decided to go and take a look for myself. Should I be worried or take any precautions prior to my visit? Does anyone have experience with anything like this? If it helps, her dad visited last, and he stated that even upon approaching the house, he felt an eerie, skin-crawling feeling before he too witnessed the portal. We lost about 4 hours of time in 30 seconds. I'm not sure if this is considered a glitch, a time slip, or just illusion, but this is something that happened to me and my family that we can't explain. Summer 2011, in the car were me, 19, my sister, my dad, and my stepmom. We were on our way to a campsite. We had other family joining us. My uncle and Nan both arrived separately, called us saying they were setting off, asked if we needed anything from the shops, and let us know their arrival time. We were over halfway there, they would be arriving about 3 hours after us. We carried on driving, switched radio stations, and went through a tunnel. When we came out, the phone was ringing again. It was my nan asking where we were, and she sounded relieved that she had got hold of us. My nan and uncle had already arrived at the campsite. My dad said, "Oh, so you're already there, save us a pitch then," and my nan responded, "Where have you been, if you're still on your way?" The conversation didn't make sense. My dad got frustrated and said, "What do you mean, where have we been? You just spoke to us." My grandmother informed us, "We've been calling you because we couldn't get hold of you." My stepmom pointed to the time on the radio, and about 4 hours had passed. 4 hours had passed in 30 seconds, my dad ended the call with my nan, and for a moment we were silent. My sister said, "What's going on?" My dad said the time must have changed when we changed the radio station, and our family was playing a dumb joke. Our phone showed time had passed, again silence. We arrived, briefly spoke about it with family, and ignored it. We have spoken about it maybe 2 to 3 times. Either my dad is convinced that we underwent a time vortex, experienced abduction, or our stepmom jokingly drugged us. My stepmom says we must have gotten the times wrong or, at worst, had some shared delusions or amnesia. Either way, we don't know what happened. A man named Todd Sees lived next to a mountain, in Pennsylvania, I think, and one morning he went up it on his ATV to watch for deer. He never came home. A huge search ensued, and for a full day nobody could locate any trace of him, apart from his ATV left at the top of the mountain. On the second day, they unexpectedly found him near his house, in a location that had already been searched multiple times. His naked body was a shriveled husk, completely drained of blood, and covered in injuries consistent with a fall from a great height. His clothing and boots littered a wide area, with one boot perched 75 feet up in a tree. The FBI and other high-level government officials came swooping in, which the family thought was weird. They refused to release the body to the family and would not give them any info. Meanwhile, 2 separate witnesses went to local law enforcement, trustworthy farmers who were outside that early morning, and both reported seeing a UFO hovering at the top of the mountain, then shooting down a beam of light, and then seeing what looked like a person floating upward to the craft. It's pretty indisputable what happened to poor Todd Sees, emo, and I can't imagine how horrific his death probably was. I don't understand why this case doesn't get more mainstream attention. The other case is about a middle-aged guy in, if I recall correctly, somewhere in Europe who went for a walk and never returned home. A search ensued, and eventually he was found dead in a place that would have been impossible for him or anyone to put his body. He was lying on top of a big pile of something, coal or something like that. There was no evidence of anyone climbing the pile to place him there. The only possibility was that someone dropped him there from above. He had a horrific look of absolute terror frozen on his face. It was revealed that he had succumbed to a heart attack due to extreme fear. There was something else unexplainable, which was that the man had a week's worth of beard growth on his face even though he'd been clean-shaven when he left his house only a day or so before. It appears to be a clear instance of alien abduction, and I can't even begin to imagine the terrifying sights he witnessed. Did I slip into another dimension? My head is still spinning, and I literally cannot figure this out. My grandparents live in an agricultural area, and my grandfather owns an absolutely massive amount of property, something like 300 acres, on which he runs a cattle farm. They have been residing in a house on this property for as long as I can remember. Quite a ways off but within easy viewing distance of the house are 2 huge grain silos that are ancient and falling apart from disuse. If you don't know what a grain silo is, it is like a massive metal barrel, approximately 5 stories tall, used in the old days for storing grain through the winter. I've always been fascinated with the 2 old silos, and I get to see them regularly as I visit my grandparents often. In fact, I painted a picture of them when I was in high school. Anyway, the last time I visited, I think I encountered some sort of glitch. Looking back on it, I realized the entire day was just off, with very unusual weather, but I thought nothing of it at the time. It was overcast but sunny at the same time, and the clouds were hanging low, almost like fog that never reached the ground. The air felt electrified, yet there was no thunder, lightning, or rain. We were driving up a hill, and if I turned my head, I would be able to see the 2 silos. As I mentioned earlier, I love looking at them, so as I started to turn my head, an icy chill ran up my back. My head spun, my heart quickened, and I had to physically steady myself. Some deep primal instinct told me not to look at the silos. Keep in mind the silos were not even in my field of vision yet, so I don't understand why I would have felt like this. Despite my hard-headedness, I felt compelled to examine the silos. There were 3 silos. It seemed like my vision rippled, and I felt sick to my stomach, but I blinked it away and looked again. 3 silos. I immediately asked my mom, who was in the car with me, how many silos my grandfather had, and without looking, she immediately blurted 3. Then a look of confusion overshadowed her face as if her mouth had said something that surprised her. 2? No, 3. 3. There are 3, I'm sure, she said as if she was trying to convince herself. An air of confusion hung in the car for the rest of the ride to Grandma's house, and when we got there, I asked Grandma the same question, without mentioning that I thought there had been 2 before. She said there were 4. Keep in mind she looks at these things every day. We discussed it for a while, but none of us seemed content with 2, 3, or 4, so eventually we got in the farm truck and rode out to the silos to get a better look. Sure enough, there were 3. I felt sick, my grandmother was shocked, and my mom acted like she knew it all along. What was especially strange was that the third one was wedged unnaturally between what I consider to be the original 2. It was even a different color. It almost looked like bad video game design. Reality shifted while I was driving. Sometime around 2019, I was driving home with my partner on the same familiar road I drove every day. Suddenly everything went quiet, and it was as if only I existed for a second. Suddenly, I felt suspended in time, and my entire reality abruptly shifted, moving at least 1 kilometer to the left. I don't know how else to describe it, but I watched the world in front of me quickly move, and it physically felt like the car was picked up and placed down by a giant hand all the way over to the left, except the road and all my surroundings moved too. It happened very fast, yet it felt like slow motion at the same time. I was driving and had to quickly pull over, and I just sat there, unable to say anything except for repeating that we just moved kilometers to the left. My partner was weirded out, but he could tell by how I acted that what I experienced was genuine. He didn't experience it like I did, but he said he watched me experience it and felt something was off. Ever since that day, I honestly felt like the whole world has moved over to the left, and I feel crazy when I think about it. I go to landmarks and old familiar roads, and they feel like they are slightly over where they used to be. It constantly goes through my head when places feel off now, and I have never heard of any similar experiences. I literally felt my car get picked up and quickly placed back down along with the entire scenery, and I've never gotten over it. Even though I have had a lot of other crazy experiences in my life, nothing has stuck with me quite like this, and I wonder if anyone else has ever had anything like this happen. I do a lot of camping, hiking, canoeing, etc. I've always thought of myself as being excellent at having a sense of direction. I'm not even sure if it's a temporary loss of my sense of direction. It's more one of those I could have sworn that tree was over there and not there kind of moments. It always happens after a couple of nights of sleeping in the same area in the wilderness. This is real, genuine confusion, completely a mystery to me. I can recall this happening 3 times out of a lot of camping trips I've had. 2 of the times I was alone, and the other time there were 3 of us. One of my friends had the same feeling. I know there are illnesses where someone has a destitute sense of direction, but as far as I know, they are more permanent and often just mean they have no idea where the hell they are ever. My experiences are temporary, as I've gone on many trips without ever feeling it. 2 of the times I was alone, it was in the middle of butt-duck nowhere, Northern Ontario, Canada. Does anyone know what this is? I personally would like to believe since it's in such a remote area, it's some ducked-up rendering issue the Matrix has. I'm probably just crazy, but yeah. We just lost time. It is currently 1:10 a.m. on December 19th. On December 18th, earlier tonight, at approximately 4:30 p.m., my boyfriend and I left for a 2-hour trip to see a concert. We got there by 7 p.m. and left the venue at 9 p.m. We did not consume any alcohol or drugs at the show, we are both completely sober. We drove for about half an hour before stopping at a rest stop with a restaurant inside for truckers. We stopped to get food, and the service was very slow. There were several older gentlemen sitting around a bar area in the restaurant and 2 female waitresses. We waited about 30 minutes for our food, didn't eat much of it, it was gross, paid, and left by 10 p.m. My boyfriend checked his GPS before we left and looked at me and said, "We will be home by 11:30, as he had texted friends and planned to be online to play video games at midnight. We got in the car and drove, and after driving through an entire album and having several lengthy conversations, I checked the GPS and said, "Wow, we still have an hour left." It felt like the drive was taking forever. We drove for a while longer, and my boyfriend checked the GPS. There was 1 hour and 30 minutes left in our journey. The drive is a straight shot on the highway, extremely simple. I would have noticed if we went the wrong way. But somehow, we still had an hour and a half left to drive home, even though we had been on the road for over an hour since leaving the rest stop. We both immediately start to feel really freaked out and consider every possible explanation for the situation. My boyfriend then says that he had looked at the miles remaining on the gas tank earlier, and it had said 312, but now it reads 106. This meant that we had traveled an additional 100 miles. We were on the same highway we had taken on our way there. An hour of our time remains unaccounted for. I suspect we were driving in circles on the highway. My boyfriend said he felt like he saw the same sign for a town many, many times. We both feel extremely shaken and wish we had answers. Missing time, one of my most inexplicable experiences. For context, when I was in high school, I lived with my mom in my childhood home, which was in the middle of nowhere. My bus ride was over 40 minutes, and my house was at the end of a dead-end road with only 4 other houses on it. Normally my mom worked weekdays and would be leaving before I went to the bus, but shifts had been switched around for some reason, which sometimes happened. I woke up at 6:50 as normal, got ready, and left the house at 7:30. I remember specifically my mom was loading the dishwasher when she said goodbye to me. I walked down to the beginning of our dead-end road, which was a 2 to 3 minute walk at the most. Across from the road was, presumably still is, a crappy public beach on a very small isolated lake. The beach is where the bus stops. The bus came at 7:40 every day. Mine was one of the first stops, so it was almost always exactly on time. I got to the bus stop as normal. I was the only one picked up there, and no houses were visible from the stop. This date was 10 or 11 years ago, so I had no cell phone yet. I know some people did by then, but part of the reason I didn't have one was there was no reception where I lived. I didn't have a watch either, but obviously I was used to the time the bus came at. Soon I felt the time had definitely passed, but I waited another few minutes to make sure. I still couldn't even hear the bus. Once or twice there'd been a substitute driver, and the bus came extremely early, so I figured that must have happened. It was obviously not coming, so I walked back home, keeping an ear out, of course, as I went, but still no bus. I get back to the house. It should be about 7:50. I open the door, and my mom is wiping the counters. She has just started the dishwasher. The little clock on the front shows only 1 minute into the cycle. She's really surprised to see me. How could I have missed the bus when I left with so much time before it came? I'm equally confused about that. She isn't mad at all. She just watched me leave with plenty of time to catch the bus, and she says she'll drive me to school. She has errands to do anyway in town, so no problem. This is when she glances up at the kitchen clock, the same one I checked my leaving time on when she was saying bye to me, and says, "What?" It's precisely 3 minutes before 9 a.m. We stare at each other in stunned silence. Is the clock broken somehow? We soon realize all the clocks are the same. The clock in the car is also the same. I end up being an hour late for school. My mom refused to talk about the experience even when it happened, nervously laughing it off as weird. She hates/seems afraid of any paranormal stuff and has always been that way. She would get upset if I ever discussed any paranormal things like they were real. I have no idea what happened here. I didn't notice any mysterious injuries after the event or anything, and I didn't see or hear anything strange during it either. Fairy circle. So something strange and kind of magical happened recently, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. My son and I were out walking my dog today when we came across a fairy circle. My son didn't appreciate what it was and was going to walk into it before I stopped him. We have Irish heritage, so I have some understanding of Irish and UK mythology. Once I explained, my son got worried he would attract some bad luck. We felt like we should leave a gift and Googled what would be good, so we returned later with a piece of rose quartz. I collect minerals and gems, so I had some spare, and placed it just outside the circle as an offering. As we did this, 2 black labradoodles ran up to us out of nowhere. Their owner was in the far distance, but interestingly, they stopped and didn't enter the circle. They were friendly, just hanging around outside the perimeter. It felt really significant, like maybe they knew something we didn't about that spot. I'm curious if anyone else has had a similar experience or knows what this might symbolize. Could the black dogs be some kind of omen or protector? And what about them staying out of the circle? Does that mean anything? I would love to hear any thoughts or stories. I have personally seen a UFO myself while staying at a hunting cabin out in rural farmland in western New York. On a pleasant summer night, my friends and I sat around a fire, enjoying our drinks and other activities, which naturally led us to gaze up at the sky frequently. We noticed a flying object, which isn't too unusual for the area, as it's commonly flown over by commercial aircraft, but this thing was much lower than a commercial airplane would be and triangular in shape. It had a green glow around it, almost like an aurora, and we watched it for quite a few minutes as it seemed to hover in place over us for several minutes. The colors around it changed to purple, and it shot off almost instantaneously. Even though I had previously been a believer, that was truly remarkable. Not only that, but there are actually newspaper articles from the 60s about a UFO encounter literally right down the road that I managed to find online. The gist of the story was that a farming couple had called the police due to a saucer-shaped vehicle that was interfering with their cows and flying directly above and around their farm. The police investigated upon arrival and reported witnessing the saucer take off. Pretty crazy. I kept seeing the same two young girls on a bike ride yesterday, when it should not have been possible. Went for a 2-hour-long bike ride yesterday on a trail. The trail has some small branching off trails, but the trail itself is a relatively straight line weaving back and forth over a creek. At some point when I was crossing the bridge on my way back, I saw two younger girls decide to leave the group they were with and start cycling back in the direction I was going in. I passed them since they were going relatively slow. They were pretty easy to remember. There was a much smaller girl, and the one was larger but still relatively the same age. The smaller one had a really bright purple chrome bike. As I passed them, I heard the older one say, "Do not tell my mother I'm not eating." Which I remembered because I found it a little concerning. About 30 minutes later I pass one of the branching off trails, and there are the two girls again, coming my way. Didn't make sense to me since I passed them before, and they shouldn't have been able to make a longer route and still meet me at the pace they were riding at. I ignored it and continued to bike. Maybe 15 minutes later I see them coming my way on the same path I'm on. Now this should definitely not have been possible. They didn't pass me, they were still biking at the same pace, and there was absolutely no way they should have been there based on the direction they were going at the last time I saw them. As they passed me, I heard the older one say, "Do not tell my mother I'm not eating." I stopped in my tracks. She said it the exact same way as she said it the time before. I initially thought they might be playing a trick on me, but the fact that they appeared twice in unexpected locations left me feeling spooked. I think my house has a portal. I moved into my house in 1985 after the birth of my second daughter. From the start, there were strange goings on. My living room door handle would rattle every night, but because it was next to the front door, I put it down to drafts. My husband was home one night, and I was wide awake trying to fall asleep when I watched a monk walk in my room, round and out through a wall. I was shaking my husband awake, shouting, "Look, look, there's a monk," but he was too late to see it and said I was dreaming. We argued about it. 6 weeks later I'm home with just my two kids, and again I go to bed, and the monk appears again, reading me the last rites. That's what I thought. I shouted, "I'm not a Catholic." And he disappears instantly. Then my eldest daughter said to me one day, "I like that old lady." I said, "Which old lady?" She said, "The old lady who comes in my room and reads to me every night." My husband said she was just dreaming, and we left it at that until I heard her quietly speaking one night. She sat up in bed, her eyes wide open, her arm extended as if she were holding someone's hand and staring directly at them. I asked what she was doing, and she just put her arm down, laid back down, and went to sleep. I thought, yeah, she's dreaming. When she mentioned the old lady again, I asked her to describe her. She said she had gray hair and round glasses. Anyway, we never really talked about it again, and I knew if there was a problem, my daughter would tell me. 3 years after giving birth to my son, I relocated my girls to a bedroom I had previously designated as a junk room. This room had always given me unease, as I had once heard a woman laughing hysterically there. When I opened the door, I found no one present, but the rocking chair was rocking on its own. I just closed the door and thought, fine, whoever it is having fun. Then the real activity started. My youngest girl would tell me a man would stop her from coming to my room at night and make her go back to bed. She swears to this over 30 years after it happened. One night, I heard my youngest daughter repeatedly calling for me, so I hurried upstairs to her room, only to come to a sudden halt. My girl is standing up out of bed, having a tug of war with her quilt against something unseen. The quilt is in the air with nothing at one side to hold it up, and it's being tugged by my daughter and by whatever else had hold of it on the other end. I think I was in disbelief and said the typical mom style, "What on earth is going on?" My daughter says, "He won't let me have my quilt." At this point I realize I'm not imagining the situation and neither is my daughter. I yell, "Leave my child's room immediately and refrain from disturbing her in the future, you are not welcome." Then what I can only describe as 3 lines of light whooshed so fast it was a split second, going over my shoulder and out of the room. I put my daughter back to bed and told her to shout if she needed me. I look back, and so many paranormal things have happened and are still happening in this house. I can't believe lack of money and a mortgage. I bought the house after 2 years of living here, have managed to keep me here for 34 years and keep quiet about the stuff that's happened. I put the experience down with the monk as dreaming, like my husband said, because even I thought it was ludicrous. Why would a monk be in my room? Until 2 years ago, I started researching my area and found out the land my house was built on belonged to a monastery. Are mirrors portals to the paranormal realm? 3 years ago I had a very weird encounter. I used to smoke weed, a lot of it. I am not sure, maybe it messed up my psyche or something like that. Well, I came home after meeting a new friend, we smoked, and thereafter, he dropped me at home. My mind felt weird as soon as I opened the door. Dogs kept barking at me. I hear dogs barking every time I smoke. It almost feels like every single dog in the city is barking at me. I got an unusual call from my dad and stepmom. They said they're coming home for some reason. I didn't question that. Furthermore, I ran into the bathroom, took Visine, put a drop into my eye, and I felt like being watched, started shaking rapidly, and became very chilly, cold. When I lowered my head, there it was, my reflection in the mirror smiling at me. He said, "Let me show you." I got dizzy and almost blacked out. There was ringing in my ears and I was shivering. I ran out of the bathroom upstairs as soon as I get the chance and got into bed, my safe space. Everything after felt weird. I felt super feminine, stuff that isn't usual started happening. Like my father gave me money, one of them caught my eye, Da Vinci True Man on the back of it. It will show up in my stories very often. When I decided to stop shivering and went downstairs where my stepmom made me tea and talked in a normal tone with me, I still felt like I wasn't me. I was some kind of feminine being inside my body. We probably had the best talk I've ever had with her. Too awful I don't remember much except being super paranoid. Could someone please clarify what occurred? Time slip. I'm a 20-year-old female. I live in California with my boyfriend and our German Shepherd. I am a big believer in the paranormal now, but I didn't used to be. My experiences in life, however, have forced me to think differently. The story I'm going to recount takes place when I was 18. I was living with my mom in a small apartment in one of the shadier neighborhoods of Los Angeles. I was working the dinner shift at a 24-hour McDonald's. The child support check stopped a month prior, so I was trying to help my mom make ends meet. The night before the events took place, I was at a friend's house. So after work, I came home with my overnight bag. I opened the front door of my apartment, set my bags down, and say hi to my mom, who is in the kitchen washing dishes. She doesn't respond, so I greet her a little louder. Still no answer. I shrug it off and walk in the hallway toward my room. My bedroom is across from my mom's room, so when you are standing in one, you can see into the other. When I walked past her room, I froze. My mom was sitting on her bed reading, wearing something different than she had been minutes before. My mom looks up and asks what's the matter, and I ask her how she was there when she was washing dishes not 1 minute before. She looks at me puzzled. I wasn't doing dishes, I've been reading for 2 hours. I tell her that I saw her in the kitchen wearing something different. She laughs and asks what she was wearing. A black tank top and blue shorts. She stops laughing. "And you said I was doing dishes?" she asks. I nod and ask whether she did them or not. "I did," she says. "Yesterday," she said she had also been wearing the clothes I described the day before. I had no way of knowing this. I hadn't been home the night before. I think about this a lot even today. I'll never know what really happened that day. Buried my dead cat. It came home later that night. This incident happened about 5 years ago, in my senior year of high school. Unfortunately, my cat Gordon passed away peacefully earlier this morning, which prompted me to share one of my favorite stories of him with this community. Around 6 a.m. one January morning, my mom called me saying she had seen a dead black cat on the road right behind our house while leaving for work. Gordon was always an outdoor cat, and because he didn't have a litter box and we would rather not be woken up, we threw him out overnight, every night. This particular morning he hadn't shown up for breakfast, which had never happened in 10 years. My dad and I feared the worst. We walked out onto the road behind our house, and sure enough, there's a dead tuxedo cat lying right in the center. Body still warm. I had a hard time looking at it, but there was no doubt in either of our minds that it was Gordon. He had a characteristic, millimeter-thin white streak of fur on his nose. One of his ears was cut up at the top from a fight he was in years back. I checked the bottom of his paws and saw the familiar pink and black markings. We brought him to the backyard, dug about 3 feet down, wrapped him in one of my old t-shirts, piled the dirt back on, and then covered the spot with a heavy stone slab. Fast forward to 8 p.m., I'm walking towards the kitchen, past my front door, and I thought I heard a meow. I was sure I was imagining it in my grief, so I ignored it for now. Around 9 p.m., I walk past the front door again. This time my dad is in the living room watching television. I hear a meow again, and this time I glance at my father and notice that he's looking at the door as well. Fully expecting to be horribly disappointed, I open the door. And in walks Gordon, not a scratch or speck of dirt on him. In over 10 years living at that house, we had never seen another cat, much less a completely identical tuxedo cat. We put a message in our neighborhood newsletter, but no one ever came forward saying that we had buried their cat. And before anyone asks, no, I never dug up the grave. Strange childhood experience. Most of the time when I tell this childhood experience of mine to people, they don't know what to say. I've never met anyone that can relate to this, and my family doesn't believe me about it. I grew up in a small town in NH. I used to play in the woods a lot as a young kid. I was usually told to stay close enough to the house that I could hear my mom yell to me to come home. There were tons of rocks and trees to play with. I believe I was around 7 to 8 at the time. One day my mom was working, and my dad was home watching me. I told him I was going to head out into the woods and go a little farther than usual, but I wouldn't be gone for too long. He said okay, but be safe, I'm going to take a nap. I knew that meant I had a few hours. I decided to go farther into the woods than I had ever gone. I knew there was a dirt road about half a mile straight back from my backyard through the woods. I put a watch on my wrist, and I packed a bag with water in case something happened or I couldn't find my way home. I watched the time on my watch as I walked straight out into my backyard, continuing in a straight line through the woods, so that I could easily find my way back home. I was young, I had no idea how long it took to walk half a mile. I walked for about 1 hour when I started to get a little worried that I hadn't found the road yet. Then all of a sudden I could see something in the distance that looked like water. As I got closer, it seemed that there was a huge, beautiful lake. It was the most beautiful lake I had ever seen, and it remains so to this day. It had the perfect reflection, and I remember it looking so serene. There were no houses on the lake, at least none that I could see. It looked like the water went on forever. The only sign of human activity was what appeared to be 3 old, falling apart wooden cabins. Something about them seemed old/air. I remember yelling hello just to hear the sound of my voice echo and no reply. I wanted to ensure I wasn't on the cabin owner's property. I wanted to go down to the water and touch it, but I just happened to be up on a steep cliff-like edge with lots of sand and rocks going down. I was afraid that if I went down, I wouldn't be able to get back up by myself. I was so excited to have found the lake. I wanted to show my parents so they could take me back there to get down to the water safely. So I had looked at my watch and said, okay, it took me 1 hour to get here, it should take me 1 hour to walk straight back and get home. After walking in the woods for about an hour, I started to worry a little but kept walking straight. After an hour and 6 minutes, I finally saw my house. As I had gotten back, my mom was just getting home from work. I ran inside, told my parents about the lake I had discovered, and asked them to go for a walk with me so I could show it to them. They were shocked at what I was saying and told me that was impossible and that there was no lake behind us or any large bodies of water in those woods. They said that it was impossible that I walked for an hour straight back because after half a mile I would have hit the dirt road and then the highway. They refused to go out there with me and asked if I had fallen and hit my head. My mom said that I must have daydreamed it or fallen asleep in the woods and dreamt it. I remember it clear as day because it was the first time that they refused to believe what I was telling them, and their reaction to what I had told them shocked me as well. To this day I have so many questions. I have never gone out there by myself since then. I don't know if seeing the lake was a spiritual symbol of some sort or if I came close to something negative/evil. I have so many questions about what happened and why. If anyone has any information, please let me know in the comments. UK stairs in the woods. So yesterday, 16th of February 2021, I had an encounter with an odd staircase that led upwards around 6 feet. I could tell it was 6 feet because I was 5-ish. I was walking along a path in the country that was completely alien to me. I hadn't been there before. After walking about 8 miles, I come across a 6 feet high staircase. It had white sides, and the floorboards were only slightly weathered. It was a pretty nice day, with a light wind from the north, and the sun was shining through thin clouds. Fortunately, I was with a friend, or something worse could have happened. I hadn't known of any of the paranormal links that these stairways have, so naturally, like the aspiring musician I am, I photographed it for an album cover. I did notice the warmth upon touch, but I chose to dismiss it as it had been exposed to sunlight. When I climbed the stairs, I sat down on the 6th or so step and took the picture, and it came back as something different. The picture had inverted colors, which was odd considering it was an iPhone 11, and I doubt it would have been corrupted or something. The second thing was a woman behind me that stood head and shoulders above the stairway. My friend didn't say anything about that. So naturally I walked the stairway to heaven. Led Zeppelin fans will know, and I got forcefully knocked off and landed on my back. Then my friend disappeared. The time had stayed the same, progressing as normal, so he hadn't had any time to run off. Then when I looked behind me, I noticed a 7-foot-tall woman. I honestly was a mix of confused and scared. My memory became blurry at that point, but I do remember running from her and finding my friend. The next thing I remember is him dragging me home and me having a bite mark on my stomach. Back in 2020 I had about a half-hour drive to go pick up a friend for a fire pit I was having that night. I had built the pit that morning after meeting my dad, who worked the Lowe's night shifts, at the store around 5 a.m. to pick up the stones and gravel. At the age of 17 to 18, my sleep schedule was quite irregular, so I made the decision to stay up all night, knowing that I wouldn't be able to wake up on time. So at 5 a.m. I pick up the stuff, drive home, rake up and shovel the area, and then place the stones. I finished around 11 a.m. By 1 p.m., I was back on track and driving to pick up my friend. At this point, I was exhausted and began to nod off intermittently, a phenomenon I had never experienced before or even to this day. All I know is that about 20 minutes later I was in the driveway, and my friend was getting in the car with absolutely no memory of the drive at all. Following this, I remained alert for the remainder of the day, made a smooth drive back home, went fishing, finished the fire by 2 a.m., and fell asleep as soon as my head touched the pillow. Still don't know if I fell asleep behind the wheel and somehow miraculously made it the rest of the way, which is about 15 minutes on the highway. No clue what happened, but I know damn well better now not to stay up for over 24 hours and then get behind the wheel. I grew up in Chinle on the Navajo Reservation in northeast Arizona. There's a canyon next to the town that has a lot of tribal history along with old ruins from the people before the Anasazi. My friends and I, for fun in high school, would sometimes go hiking or ghost hunting late at night, as there was nothing to do in small rural towns in the USA. There is a location known as Massacre Cave, where the US Army/government slaughtered many Navajos during the war. We would typically go around 12 a.m. to 3 a.m. It was a cold vibe all around, and then out of nowhere, crazy death screams and gunshot echoes were heard. The sound of people falling from the cliffs filled our ears. It weirded us out, so we walked back to the car, which then had child-sized handprints all over. I thought it was wild because I had heard stories from relatives that had tried the same thing before and the folklore from the tribe's religion/spirituality. To make sure I wasn't imagining things, I left the reservation after high school, joined the Marines, met a girl not from the area, brought her home to the reservation, and we were bored, so I asked if she wanted to check it out. It was late winter by this time, and it had snowed a bit the day before, but for some reason I wanted to go. So I take her and myself to the Massacre Cave overlook. The moon is out in full so the snow reflects all the light through the pines. No noise but that of cold wind. I'm talking to her about the history of the area. It's late, cold, and silent. Since nothing was happening, I moved in to kiss her, but all I heard was hay from the trees. I shine my light, but nothing. We go back to the truck as it starts to snow more with the feeling of being followed. We heard crunching noises from the snow, but they weren't our own. The truck appeared to have less snow on it, but then we noticed something else, someone's tiny handprints. Crystal portal. I've always been inclined to explore planes that go beyond the earthly, whether spiritual or paranormal. I'm not particularly frightened by any of it, and believe me, I've seen some shit. However, something recently has disturbed me, and I'm here today to ask for your thoughts, suggestions, jokes, and analyses. I began working with crystals about 2 years ago out of personal interest, and I truly found them to be quite comforting, especially during daily meditation practices. I carried them everywhere with me and have even dedicated the top shelf of my book rack to the hundreds of crystals I have collected. Part of regular crystal care is making sure that whenever you receive a new crystal, you should perform a cleansing ritual to rid the stone of a previous owner's energy or of unwanted spirits that may have formed an attachment to them. I have cleansed all of my crystals, and I have never experienced any issues with bad energy entering my home. However, my boyfriend and I bought a bulk of crystals online last year for gifting purposes and never bothered to cleanse them because there were so many. The various crystals are currently sitting in a pile together in the back of my closet, and though they are enclosed in plastic bags, I feel that they may have acted as a portal to the spiritual plane, allowing something harmful to enter my home. Here's why. During the week that we purchased the crystals, my boyfriend and I both saw our cat's water dish levitate for a moment before dropping back down over top of her food dish, followed by the cat acting terrified and bewildered. We decided that it might be something we thought we saw but really didn't. But now, for the past month or so, my boyfriend and I have been hearing very strange sounds coming from our bedroom and closet. One night, we were sitting on the couch in our living room, The door to our bedroom was closed, and we began hearing the sound of 2 hands clapping behind the closed door. The cat, perched on a chair near the hallway, had all her fur standing up and her saucer plate eyes fixed on the door. We searched the room and found no evidence of a presence in it or the closet, but the cat was darting around the room nervously, which added to our concern. A week after that, we were lying in bed and heard scratching sounds coming from the closet, and I saw a dark figure slide from the end of the bed to the floor. Immediately after I saw the figure, our Amazon Echo in the hallway lit up and would not turn off even after we repeatedly said, "Alexa, stop." Besides all of these occurrences, my boyfriend and I admit that we both feel quite drained whenever we spend any time in the house, as if a heaviness is robbing us of all of our energy. In fact, we both sleep an average of 10+ hours each night and still wake up feeling as if we didn't get a wink of sleep. I feel depressed when I spend time in our bedroom or bathroom, though at times I feel as if I can't leave either room for very long before I feel drawn to it once again. This kind of freaks me out. Today, I burned cedar in the house and asked if there was a dark presence to leave us alone and find somewhere else to go. I told it that I am not afraid of it and that it has no purpose and no right to be here. As I walked from room to room with the smudge, I could sense that the presence was doing its best to hide from me. I sensed that it had buried itself in the closet and that it intended to spend more time in my apartment. For a moment, I imagined this presence as something that crawls upon the floor, something that is excellent at keeping itself hidden. For now, I am just going to continue to ask it to leave and to smudge with cedar and sage. Is there anything else I can do? Strange light phenomenon in the forest, searching for similar experiences. I had an unusual experience a while ago that I can't quite explain, and I'm hoping to hear from anyone who might have had a similar encounter or can shed light on what it could have been. One autumn evening, during a cold and damp time of the year, I was walking in a forested park area with a friend. We had gotten a bit lost and were wandering through the woods. Both our phones died, and we couldn't get any photos of what we saw, but what happened next still sticks with me. We noticed a strange light moving among the bushes. It wasn't like a typical flashlight or any sort of vehicle light, it was glowing, but it didn't really illuminate the surrounding area. The light was silent and changed color and size as it moved through the trees. It seemed to be following us, maintaining a vertical path, until we decided to leave the area. We didn't hear any sounds, and the light seemed to hover or glide effortlessly. We both felt uneasy, and while I've always considered myself a skeptic, this experience left me with many questions. I'm not sure what it could have been, but it didn't feel like anything ordinary. It was definitely unsettling at the time. Has anyone had a similar experience with an unexplained light like this? Could it have been something natural, or are there any possible paranormal explanations for this kind of phenomenon? I'd love to hear your thoughts or if anyone has encountered something like this before. Portal? Paranormal? I have a few stories that I want to share with you that have happened to me. I share them in hopes of getting answers or to see if anyone else has had any experiences with these types of things. This is one of those stories. A couple of years ago, I was hanging out with my mom and having drinks in our garage. We decided to go to our local liquor store to get another pack of beers. It was around 7 or 8 p.m. On our way back into our cul-de-sac, about 3 houses down from ours, we saw what looked like a cloud but only like 20 to 30 feet off the ground. It was on the right-hand side of the street near our neighbor's tree. Mind you, it was a clear night with no other clouds in the sky. It was small, hazy around the edges, and seemed to have a bright light coming from within it. It legit looked like it was daytime in the cloud, but it was dark out. We were mid-conversation when we both stopped and just stared at it. I slowed the truck until we stopped about 10 feet away. Without looking away, I asked my mom if she was seeing this thing too. As soon as she said yes, the cloud started floating across the street to the left-hand side. I started driving forward to see where it was going, but as soon as it got to the left-hand side of the street, where my other neighbor had a tree, it vanished. I quickly pulled up to my house, parked my truck in the driveway, and we both ran to investigate, but it was completely gone. We were so weirded out because we've never seen anything like that. It was also strange that it started moving as soon as we started talking about it, clearly acknowledging that we were seeing this strange cloud. It also looked like it was trying to hide because the neighbor's tree on our left-hand side had more leaves than the tree from our other neighbors on our right-hand side. The light coming from within this cloud was so bright it seemed like it was daytime inside of it. It was as if we could see something inside of it, like soft shapes, but it was difficult to make out since it was bright. Every time my mom and I talk about it and try to find some type of explanation, we end up asking ourselves if what we saw that night was some type of portal. What are your thoughts? I've tried looking it up to see if anyone else has ever seen something similar, but I never find anything. I guess I'm just curious to know what it was and why it moved and disappeared the way that it did. Please let me know if you have any questions. The night sky disappeared. I've seen/felt several weird things in various national parks, BLM land, and national forests. I'm actually going to get my wilderness first responder certification this March because of some uneasiness last summer in a remote park. I did a volunteer program after college, and we frequently went on nature retreats as a big group. The event happened in November 2018 at a campground just east of Mount Rainier National Park. It was so remote that no one in our nearly 50-person group had cell phone service. Our only tie to the outside world was a ranger who checked on us daily. These retreats prohibited the use of alcohol or drugs. So no, none of us were intoxicated in the slightest. There were a couple of cabins throughout the campground, and if you walk through the trees a bit, there was a sizable lake. A few friends/housemates and I wanted to look at the night sky because we knew it would be full of stars. This is Washington State, so all the trees are massive and block out most of the sky. The only place we'd really be able to see stars would be over the small lake. So we head down to the lake area despite it being pretty cold. There are 2 logs for us to sit on. We settle in, waiting to see some shooting stars. It was a running joke in our house that we needed to see 5 shooting stars when camping/in the woods to fall asleep. 4 out of 5 of us in this group lived together at the time. So we are all steadily watching the night sky for about 10 to 15 when this happens. It only happened for maybe half a second. But we all saw it. For the shortest moment of time, half the sky went completely white. Just stark white, like a sheet of paper was placed over half the night sky, right down the middle. After a moment, one of us said, "Did everyone see that?" We all confirmed what we saw. I never found a solid explanation. And similarly with my other friends, these friends also told me to stop talking about it whenever I mentioned it months/years later. It wasn't scary to me. Once again, it was extremely strange, and I couldn't come up with a satisfactory explanation. Before any of us could comprehend anything beyond what I described, it vanished without a sound. It wasn't lightning. I'm from the Great Lakes region, so I know lightning. It wasn't an airplane. No idea. One weekend, my friends and I were playing online games together, as we often do. At one point, one of my friends, Vincent for short, mentioned that he needed to walk his dog and planned to take a coffee break before returning. He said he would have it for 10 minutes max since he had a very small dog. Since the time was very short, we decided to wait for him. At first we just chat patiently, and whenever the 10-minute mark arrives, we think that he will be late, as he usually is, and occasionally he can be bothered by his family, so we decide to start watching a 1-hour-long video altogether so we don't get bored. Eventually, after a total of 45 minutes, he comes back and asks if we're up for a game. We answer positively, but then we ask him what took him so long out of curiosity. Vincent asks what we mean by that, and we explain that he took much longer, so we wondered if it was his family asking him for help or something. He said that no, he just walked out the dog, drank his coffee, and came back. We told him that we had been waiting for 45 minutes for him. He starts laughing and tells us that it's impossible. He did chat with his parents a little, but he assures us it took 15 minutes at maximum. We kept explaining that all 3 of us had, in fact, had time to wait for around 10 minutes plus over half of our 1-hour-long video, so no, it didn't take as little as he claimed. We tried to get to the bottom of this, and he seemed pretty annoyed that we didn't believe him and he had no explanation. There is no point for him to hide anything. Usually, even if something private happened, he'll just say, "Oh, you know, family," and keep it there, but at least he'll confirm that he was late and took more time, but in this instance he was hellbent on saying that he didn't take that long. It wasn't to defend anything, either, since we never care when he is late, as we're used to it by now, but it felt strange that he and we clearly didn't experience the same length of time. Every time we bring it up with him, he'll stick to his version, so it's not like he is messing with us after all of that time, so our best guess is that either he didn't feel the time pass so quickly, which we doubt but would be the most likely explanation, that something happened at his place and he tried to dismiss it, although he could have just acknowledged the delay and given us a vague explanation or straight up lied, or, in fact, a time slip. There you have it, a pretty uneventful tale, I know, but I want to know if you have something more intriguing that happened to you. You are welcome to comment about your experiences. An abduction event. The following account eerily describes the reality of an alien abduction. An anonymous person wrote into Darkness Radio about her event in 2015. It started a year ago on Halloween. I was on the beach with my friends, enjoying our time by the fire. Suddenly, there was a flash of light. That's all anybody remembers. The events that followed, well, we have connected to that night. It's always the quiet ones, or so I'm told. Let's call her Jessica. Jessica, a typical goth girl, had a deep interest in the paranormal and was also a realist. She claimed to have received visits from otherworldly beings in her home at the family farm, days before the beach event. She was a self-proclaimed witch. We believe she had something to do with all this. After the night at the beach, we all, including Jessica, woke up 2 towns over in the clearing of the dense woods. No car. No clothes. Just our underwear. Jessica and her boyfriend at the time were laid near each other, hand in hand. I was the first to wake up. I rubbed my hand in my hair, and I felt something I damned well knew wasn't there before. I had needle marks in my arm, and they weren't normal marks. Something happened that shouldn't have happened. Of course, I was frustrated and very distraught, so I began to run. It was while running I heard this muffled screech or growl. I really don't know what it was, but I had to cover my ears and close my eyes. It was in that whatever amount of lost time that I woke up in a hospital. My family has no history of mental illness or anything of the sort. I'm a healthy person, and now this happens. The nurse tells me they found me on the side of the road naked and covered in handprints, bruises, and lightning bolt-looking burn marks, that I had lost a lot of blood somehow. I was dehydrated and, for lack of a better word, taken advantage of. It has now been about a year since that event has taken place. I've stayed off the radar. I haven't discussed any of this with anyone, not even my family. I haven't seen or spoken to my friends since the day I woke up in the woods. Now, I'm losing time again and waking up every morning at 2:59 a.m. Items in my home are disappearing and appearing in unexpected locations. My pets act differently now. My dog will growl for about 30 minutes every night at 5 a.m. at the window. I have a large bay window. Something is watching me, and it's not human. I've never believed in any of this stuff until it happened to me. None of this made it to the news, and I don't really know what happened to my so-called friends either. I now reside alone, and I'm trying to make sense of all of this. I don't want to definitively blame aliens, but I strongly feel that whatever happened wasn't caused by humans. No human can make a noise like that or carry 5 people miles and miles away and perform those kinds of tests on them overnight. Getting lost in the familiar forest. I live in the small village in Finland. As a Finn, I am used to moving in the woods and wilderness. I never get completely lost, etc. I hunt, hike, trail run, and fish, regular country activities. I have lived in this location for about 5 years. It's a small neighborhood, surrounded by the forest. There is a path/area where I got goosebumps and felt uneasy. Sometimes I feel like I am being followed or observed. Once I have seen a shining black column with red dots in that area. I got quite scared and ran to my home. This has happened a couple of times when I have gone through that area or via that path. I see the nearby barn, but I can't reach it. That way and path are wrong, and I feel like a loop or something. My dog seems to be confused too, that we are walking but not getting anywhere. After some time, 5 to 15 minutes, we start to reach the end of the forest. In Finnish folklore, there is a phenomenon called metsenpeito. In Finnish folklore, metsenpeito, meaning forest cover or covered by forest, refers to the belief that the forest can hide or imprison people or animals, making them invisible and lost, unable to escape, but this is not exactly the same, because I know or believe I know where I am. Best friend and I saw ourselves about 30 minutes prior. 2 years ago something bizarre happened to my best friend and me, and we've been puzzled ever since. We have been searching for an explanation or similar experiences, but despite our frequent discussions, we have been unable to find any. My best friend and I went to the mountains to hike and run with 2 of our other close friends. It was winter, and the weather was terrible with lots of ice and snow. The trailhead parking lot had been closed due to road work, so we had to park a couple of miles away down a long empty road. There was no one in the park but us that day. We regularly have outdoor adventures in this same group, but my best friend and I usually separate from the other 2, as we are a bit more fit and can move faster. We usually finish early and wait in the car for the other 2. This particular day, we finished quite early. My friend and I were jogging back to the car. On the jog back, we spotted an old cemetery just off the road. I abruptly veered off, laughing, and pulled my friend with me to go see it and explore for a minute before going back to the car, which was in sight just down the road. After this, we continued jogging to the car. Once we got to the car, we began waiting for our 2 friends to finish their hike. About 30 minutes passed, and we still did not see them. We parked our car in the opposite direction of their expected arrival. So we turned around to look for them constantly to make sure we did not miss them. It was in that moment that my best friend and I saw 2 people in the distance, running straight toward us. I said, "Oh, there they are." My friend commented that, "They're moving quick." But as they got closer, we realized that it was not our two female friends, like we thought. Instead, it was a male and a female, dressed exactly like my best friend, male, and me, female. The female also had long blonde hair, just like mine. And the pair were wearing hats. Like ours. "Wait, that's not them," I said. We got perplexed, but then we both got quiet and started to freak out a little as the running pair abruptly turned toward the cemetery, with the girl pulling the person with her, laughing. Just like we'd just done. Suddenly, the people we were seeing vanished. My best friend and I immediately looked at each other and both said, "That was US." We both just somehow knew it. We were both really freaked out by it. It really shook us up. A few moments later we saw our friends hiking to the car from the same direction. We asked them if they had seen anyone hiking or running in front of them. They said they had seen no one. We have never stopped talking about this and have spent the last couple of years trying to figure out any logical explanation, but nothing makes sense apart from a matrix glitch. Any thoughts or ideas would be greatly appreciated. Lost 1 hour and 45 minutes on a walk through a park. It must have been 1987 or 88 because I only lived in that part of town during my early 20s. There was a pub with cool rock concerts near our place, about a 15-minute walk away. The quickest way was through a park, not a big one, but it was an experimental thing to keep it in its natural state. Grass was not mowed, trees were not trimmed, they just kept the gravel road clean for walking. It felt a little bit like wilderness, in a good way. However, it was not overly isolated, as you could constantly hear the sounds of nearby streets and other urban activities. My friends and I had been through this park countless times, to the pub and back, alone or in groups. It was totally cool every time, well, until that evening. We were 3 people that night, my best friend, who was also my roommate, another student visiting from our old hometown, and me. We had been to one of the concerts, a local blues band, great music. After paying the entrance fee, we only had enough money for 1 beer each, so we weren't intoxicated. About halfway through the park, I felt something strange, an urge to get out of there. I noticed that my friends had also stopped chatting as I tried to pinpoint the feeling. But there was nothing unusual in sight or sound around us. Still, the feeling kept growing. Despite telling myself not to act foolishly, I found myself on the verge of panic. I noticed myself walking faster, the others did the same. My hand unconsciously reached out for the hand of my friend and met her hand halfway. "You feel it too?" she whispered. "Let's get out of here," I said, and we broke into a run, almost racing each other, until we could see our house. The feeling of doom was suddenly gone for me, and I could tell by the nervous jokes of the others that they felt as embarrassed about the whole thing as I did. We were already rationalizing it away as too little sleep and too much stress when I opened the door to the apartment. We had a huge wall clock in the hall, and I stopped breathing when I looked at it. We checked our watches, but they matched the clock. It had been a little over 2 hours since we left the pub. A walk that takes 15 minutes at a normal pace had taken us over 2 hours, although we ran almost half of the way. We tried to find an explanation but couldn't think of anything that made any sense. Some more nervous jokes, and we went to our separate rooms. The next morning at breakfast, I asked the others what they thought we had experienced. My roommate said in a grave voice, "It didn't happen." And I asked, "What?" And she yelled at me, which was very out of character for her, "It did not happen. Forget it. It did not happen." Dimension slip? Everyone I share the story with thinks I have made it up, but after listening to a similar post, I'm leaving it here where I might get some sympathy. Around 12 months ago, I went to get my jab. My vaccination center was a community center, and I had to go after work. Perhaps a dozen people were in the waiting area when I arrived. I signed in, got my papers, and joined the back of the seating area. A few minutes passed, and we were all startled by the fire alarm. After catching my breath, I turned and headed for the fire exit, which was the main entrance I had just entered the center through. During my wait, another woman had joined the queue behind me, meaning she left the center into the entrance hall before me, then followed by myself. As I passed through the door, I heard some official cry out, "Don't worry, guys, it's just our routine monthly test. There's no need to evacuate." I remember the woman laughing at me and joking about how we both jumped when it went off. But here is where things get strange. The two of us re-entered the main room to find it empty. No one else was there. There were no patients, staff, or nurses present. I assumed they had left by another fire exit, so I retook my place in the seating area, waiting for the nurses to come back into the room. Perhaps 10 minutes passed before I turned to the other woman and joked that they had abandoned us. She was visibly more agitated than me and didn't find my joke funny. To be honest, I think I made the joke to try and assure myself, since by then I was getting a little confused too. I started walking around the waiting area looking for another fire exit. There was indeed a second exit, but it led to the same car park, which the main entrance also led to. The two of us went back into the entrance hall, which was also empty. I popped my head through the entrance and looked into the car park, empty. I also noticed there were no cars, which, to be fair, could have always been the case. I walked to the center and couldn't remember if there had been cars before. I found it strange that there were no cars at all, so I went back to ask the woman if she had driven or remembered seeing any cars in the car park. The lady had followed me into the entrance hall. Just as I was about to ask her about the car park, I heard a voice from the main reception room. "Sorry about that, folks, we probably should have warned you before the alarm went off." The waiting room was full again, about a dozen patients, 2 or 3 nurses, and admin staff. I just stood in the entrance hall looking at the main room, and the woman beside me was also frozen. It wasn't until the receptionist, who I hadn't even realized was there, asked if we were okay that I came back to my senses. I made some excuse about being afraid of needles and sat outside in the dark for what felt like an hour. The woman tried talking to me, but I honestly had nothing to say to her, no explanation, no theory. She ordered a taxi to take her home, and I walked back there in shock. You won't believe how difficult it was trying to explain why I needed to rebook my jab. I have had everything from people claiming I made up the story because I'm afraid of needles to being a conspiracy theorist. Eventually I just stopped telling the story. Possibly a portal to another dimension? My sister and I were sharing a bed and a room at my great-grandmother's house that was probably built sometime in the 20s. The room is small and dimly lit from a medium-sized window. It only contained a full bed with a dresser with a small amount of walking space. We stayed in that room several times throughout our childhood and never noticed anything weird apart from the house just being inherently old and creepy. One night we were lying in bed about to fall asleep when I noticed that the room had 2 closets. I was immediately freaked out because I had previously thought there was only one closet. But sure enough, I definitely saw 2 separate open pitch-black closets. There was one on the left side of the bed and another on the right. I rolled over to ask my sister how many closets were in the room. She responded with, 1, before turning away from me and attempting to sleep again. I asked again, then why are there 2? She sat up, agreed that she saw 2 closets, but simply said we just must be mistaken. That was good enough for me, so we both fell asleep. When I opened my eyes in the morning to a blank, white wall, i.e., no closet on my side of the bed, I shook my sister awake and told her there was, in fact, only one closet. We never slept in that room ever again. Because it's one of my few paranormal experiences, I'll mention it occasionally, but my sister doesn't want to dwell on it. The time I lost my jewel in Eureka, California, and found it in a hollowed-out redwood miles away. My friend and I were avid mountain bikers, and we did a wonderful road trip to Northern California this summer. Outside of Eureka, there is a cool trail system called Lax Creek. We stayed there a few days and rode the trails. Anywho, I lost my jewel on a ride. It was a jewel I had laser engraved with my initials and a unique design. A few days later, we found ourselves in the grove of the Titans in the Redwoods, pretty sure, or another grove greater than 100 miles away. Along the path, there was a hollow stump with a small, crouched entrance, which I went into. Glancing around, I noticed a jewel perched upon the interior of the stump. I picked it up to discover that this was my jewel. That I had lost. No less than 100 miles away. The pod was laser engraved exactly as I had left it. This, being a complete mind duck, made me quit vaping, but I still wonder to this day the mechanism behind the forest borrowing my jewel. No other drugs or mind-altering substances were involved. This event will likely remain the greatest mystery of my life. Also, no way my friend could have possibly been involved. It fell or manifested its way out of my pocket on a ride in which he was in front of me. In the grove, I was the first to enter the tree. I had eyes on him the whole time. The second cool detail I should have included, it was placed inside the tree, right side up, about eye level on a small ledge in the bark. What was also strange is the grove in question is a busy, famous grove in the Redwoods. Why I was the one to stumble upon my jewel is surprising. Also of note, just in case somehow a stranger was responsible for leaving it there if I dropped it on the ride. Lax Creek is a very isolated place. We saw one person the 3 days we were there. And if I had dropped it on the trail, these are fast riding DH trails, bike only. Bizarre if someone were to find it. My friend and I experienced possible missing time and woke up in an impossible location with no memory. My friend and I were spending time at my house, which was situated in a rural area of southern Arizona. The house was situated on a large, mostly empty plot of land, with a trailer positioned in the middle. We would often walk this area a lot, and I knew it really well. We used ATVs to create small dirt trails. I decided we would walk to this small retention pond about half a mile away to see the gross water. The time was about 10 to 12 p.m. in September, so the sun was in the center of the sky. I noted this because occasionally the shadows get dark in the wash, and I wanted to be able to see for snakes. There was a fairly deep wash that runs into it, and it's really noticeable as a 5-foot 10-foot deep crevice in the ground. It was dry at this time, and we climbed down into it to make walking to the pond easier. Avoid doing this as it poses a significant risk. We arrived at the pond and played around for a bit. A hill on the left as you enter the wash lets you see the house. The route back is entirely straightforward. This is the only hill you could do this from, and I made a mental note to place a marker at the top so I knew the right spot to go down where there was no cactus. We both stood on the hill by my stick, we both confirmed the house in our eyesight, we grabbed each other's hands and skidded down the dirt side of the hill. When my feet hit the bottom, I blinked and let her hand go. We were not at the bottom of the hill. Despite the presence of mountains and landmarks, I was already familiar with the terrain, thanks to the presence of saguaro and water runoff patches. We were not even next to the pond anymore. Then I noticed how much later it was in the afternoon as the sun was beginning to start setting. Like the orange stage right before it is going down. At the top of the hill it was maybe about 2 o'clock, I think it makes sense for the distance and us exploring a lot. Now it was around 6 o'clock. We were nearly another half a mile away, by the old power lines and the old trail that ran at the side of the property. The hill we had left behind was now hidden behind the trees surrounding the wash, leaving us in the open. The time had passed, and neither of us knew what had just happened. The feeling was of just, how did I get here? I better get home, kind of like a feeling of shock and no emotions, just solution-based. All I knew was to disregard the facts and get my friend and me back home. I knew following the trail and lines would lead back, but I would rather not cross the washes again but didn't care as I felt like if the sun went down and we were still out there, we wouldn't make it back. I have no idea how to explain that feeling, but it may have been general shock and anxiety about the event itself. There was no way I would have been able to deduce this. We would have crossed the deep wash again, another smaller 2-foot deep wash, and then walked another third of a mile into the middle of the dirt patch near the trail/road to get there. We had already done a lot of climbing and trudging, so we did not choose that, and we would remember. My friend was silent the entire time we walked back to the house and then told me she didn't know what happened once we got to my room. I asked her about 2 years ago, and she just told me, yeah, that was weird. I have no memory of that blank, and she seems not to know either. I even told the story to my mom, and she attributed it to imaginative thinking. But it plagues me still, not knowing what or how that occurred. Lights in the forest, a lifetime of unexplained encounters. I'm not saying, in any way or form, that I'm being abducted by aliens. But this is my personal story. For as long as I can remember, I've had vivid dreams about UFOs. They come and go, sometimes disappearing for months, even years, but when they return, they are intense, more real than dreams should be. My house is surrounded by a forest, and in these dreams, the lights always appear above the treetops, silently hovering before descending closer. Recently, the dreams have become more frequent, and the details sharper, almost as if they're trying to tell me something. The lights move in strange, impossible ways, darting at incredible speeds, stopping suddenly, and hovering without a sound. There's an overwhelming silence in the dreams, suffocating and heavy. Even though I don't always see figures, I feel them watching from beyond the light. These dreams don't feel random. They feel deliberate, like something is trying to reach me. Since childhood, I've dealt with sleep paralysis, which often accompanies these experiences, but not always. When it happens, I wake up fully aware but completely paralyzed, unable to move or even cry for help. A crushing weight presses on my chest, and shadows gather around me, short, dark figures standing just at the edges of my vision. Occasionally they shift slightly, as if they're whispering among themselves. Other times, glowing red and orange orbs appear, about the size of a volleyball, hovering in my room. They pulse with an eerie energy before disappearing as quickly as they arrived. When the paralysis finally breaks, I often wake up screaming, gasping for air. My wife knows the feeling well. She's had to shake me awake many times, trying to calm me down while I catch my breath. Our house has been the site of countless strange phenomena over the years, flickering lights, objects moving on their own, and an overwhelming sense of being watched in certain rooms. Once, we even received a strange voicemail message. That recording had no missed call attached to it and went straight to voicemail, just an unidentifiable voice whispering in a language we just can't understand. We're a large family, 5 children, 2 dogs, 5 cats, and 5 chickens. Life in our home is always full of energy and activity. None of my kids had any complaints about any phenomena, but occasionally, the animals behave strangely. The dogs refuse to enter certain areas of the house for no reason, while the cats sit still for long periods, staring into empty corners as if watching something only they can see. It's nothing overtly alarming, but just enough to make us wonder if they're sensing something invisible. Some of these strange events have even been caught on video, some have only been witnessed. There have been instances of doors opening on their own, strange flashes of light in dark rooms, and orbs floating through the air, but things recently took a more disturbing turn. On December 24, 2024, during breakfast, my wife noticed something odd on our front door security camera. Intrigued, we checked the footage. Both the front door camera and a wide-angle camera on the corner of the house captured the same event, a glowing orb moving across the yard. It wasn't faint or ambiguous. You can even see the orb reflecting off my car near the end of the footage. It triggered our motion-activated lights as it passed by. It was the middle of the night, around -15 degrees Celsius. There were no insects or birds, and there was no reasonable explanation. Then, on January 17, 2025, our backyard camera recorded something even stranger. A shadow passed over the snow-covered ground, briefly blocking the moonlight. It rotated steadily above my house, but there was no visible source, nothing in the sky or around the house that could have cast it. Only a few days later, on January 21, 2025, our side doorbell camera captured another mysterious orb. This one moved with purpose, not like dust or debris, but something gliding steadily through the air. It looked disturbingly similar to what we had seen on December 24, raising more questions than answers. My wife is a practical, down-to-earth person. She's never believed in UFOs or the paranormal, always the rational one in our relationship. But after living through years of strange occurrences and now witnessing these recent events on camera, even she can't explain what's happening. The videos speak for themselves. Something unusual is happening around our home, something that feels connected to my experiences. These strange encounters aren't new to me. They've been with me since childhood, sparking a lifelong fascination with the paranormal. For nearly 10 years, I traveled across Canada and the United States in search of answers, visiting places known for strange phenomena and chasing the unexplained. It became part of my life, a relentless pursuit for meaning in the chaos. But something changed along the way. The activity at home began to intensify after each trip, almost like I was bringing something back with me. Every time I returned, the strange phenomena grew worse, more unexplained sounds, more objects moving, an overwhelming sense of being watched. It became too much. After 10 years, I quit cold turkey, cutting myself off from the paranormal field entirely. The activity at home slowed down after that, though it never truly stopped. It felt like whatever had followed me had lost interest, at least, for a while. I'm not claiming to know what any of this means. I'm not making any claims about abduction, nor am I attempting to persuade anyone of anything. But when I piece everything together, the vivid UFO dreams, the sleep paralysis with shadow figures and glowing orbs, the strange voicemail message, the videos we've captured over the years, and the recent sightings, it's difficult to ignore the connection. Maybe it's all coincidence. Maybe it's just my mind weaving patterns where there are none. But sometimes, late at night, when I wake up and feel that heavy, lingering presence in the room, I can't help but wonder if something is watching. Something that doesn't need to come often, because it already knows I'm here. My dad told me this one story. He was 15 when he migrated to the US looking for a better life. In mid-November, he found himself walking on the side of the road, enduring the cold, hunger, and the absence of passing cars, leaving him without anyone to ask for a ride. It started raining and the sun started to set, so he got scared on top of being cold and hungry. He said he got on his knees under a street lamp and started praying for the night to be over. The same moment he said amen to finish his prayer, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He quickly dried off his tears with the back of his hand and he looked up at a policeman standing in front of him with a worried face. He looked around, then at himself. His clothes were dry, and the sun was high in the sky, signaling that it was almost noon. To this day, he remains clueless about the events that transpired that night. The officer asked him if he was okay and gave him a ride to a nearby shelter after buying him a burger. Both the guy that picked him up and his partner didn't believe my dad had spent the entire night under the street lamp. They had passed by the same place a few hours earlier and didn't see him. Following deceased father through portal. We took my father off life support about 2 years ago, and he passed shortly after. Long story, but I have felt guilt and possible resentment. My sister in particular had events happen where she felt resentment from him for us making the call. Nothing can prepare you for watching a loved one die, but this was brutal. He fought to live but just couldn't get the air. I wanted to give him my breath. Unfortunately, his organs had shut down, and there wasn't much to be done medically. I've had multiple dreams about him. In some of the nightmares, he appears dead-faced and unable to communicate or express body language. Sometime he's chatting and cutting up until I communicate with him, and in detail, he's gone, and then he's mute or dead-faced. The other night I awoke to son. My dad stood by my bed. In physical form, but my head had the foggy just woke up feeling. He started talking to me, catching up. Expressing how proud I am of my success and achievements. Saying he wasn't resentful. He expressed that he had made numerous attempts to connect through dreams. We talked shortly, and he started to say it was time he had to go. Since this is not the first time I've encountered a deceased loved one in a dream, I attempt to persuade him to remain. What's the worst that could happen? You'd be stuck here with me. He says there's a way out and begins to pull away into a black portal under my antique vanity. I grip his hands and say I'm not letting go. You are staying here, or I'm coming with you. The black portal draws him in. The black portal slowly draws me in, too. As my arms enter, I feel a fleshy wall with what I describe as tendrils like the ridges on a dog's jowls on the walls. I enter and come out onto a dirt floor in what seems like a cave. There is a man at the end with a shocked face. What are you doing here? I express I followed my father here and notice I still have his severed hands in mine. The man keeps saying I'm not supposed to be here. I've been a lucid dreamer for years and tell him I've heard this before and describe him as the dream police. To which he laughed. He responded, no, it's not the dream police, but there is an order to things. I explained I just wanted more time, and he started telling me how dangerous it was for me to be here. He explained that deviating from the natural order could be likened to flying beyond the Earth's gravitational pull. If I get too far, there is nothing to tether me to my body. He also mentions he can only try to reconnect with me 3 times. I acknowledge and ask for time. I spend a while trying to locate my father. I interrogate anyone I see who might be interested in helping. One guy I talked to didn't know my dad, but I asked him about what the water looked like here. My wife had recently talked to me about a medium who said dead world water behaves differently. We are still in a cave. I saw no water, but his response was the waters are overhead terrifying. He described a world filled with monsters, giant fish, red waters, and shadows. I never found my father down there. I returned to the end of the tunnel I had come from and tried to return home. The tunnel/portal guide hands me a phone. An old standard landline phone. It tells me to call someone close to whom I'm connected. I immediately think of my little sister, though I don't know her number. He says don't worry about her number, just concentrate on her. She answers the phone. I say, it's me, your brother, trying to get home, describing everything as briefly as possible. She says slowly, Joseph, it's 2040. She explains how old my nieces are and what they have been up to. I can't say she thought I was dead, but she acted like I'd been gone for so long. The dream continues, but I find it difficult to remember more than foggy little details. The reason I share this here is because I've previously experienced something similar to this. I have recently lost pets, among other things. As a vivid lucid dreamer, I at least feel a big difference between seeing loved ones versus them being there artificially. I've had numerous lucid experiences in which I transcend boundaries that others tell me I shouldn't be. This was my father reaching out to me from beyond. I'm not sure if my decision to go with him was the right one, but I believe I took a glimpse into his new world. I hope it wasn't purgatory. I don't think so, as he was still able to reach out. I could write exhaustively about the situation and realize how crazy it sounds, but this is as real as it gets for me, and I was very reserved about sharing it. Lost time at a certain location. My best friend and I decided to go for a walk in the TNT area, mainly known for the Mothman. We parked at one of the many gates and walked to a couple of ponds that are out there. We could see the car the whole time. Out of nowhere we both get super cold. I'm rarely ever cold. We both get a weird feeling and decide to head back to the car. When we got back to the car, we looked at our phones, which we had left there, and we had been out of the car for a little over an hour when we felt that we had only been out maybe 20 minutes or less. Not to mention when we drove out, we ended up at a completely different spot than where we actually were. She grew up near there and knows that place like the back of her hand. We still have no clue how any of that happened. Has anyone had such an event happen before? I live in a small town on the mainland at the Jersey Shore. 3 friends and I were leaving for a road trip to Assateague Island, located off the coast of Maryland. We were all kind of stressed about leaving, trying to put together camping gear, enough food, etc., so we were late getting on the road. We had to drive west for a good 20 minutes on an isolated 2-lane road through the heart of the Pine Barrens to get anywhere from here, and we all took note of the exact time leaving as it was a long trip and friends from Philly were expecting to meet with us. Once on the dark, narrow highway through the pines, we all felt relieved to finally be on our way. One friend had recently seen a UFO and hadn't really shared the experience yet, so to pass the time, we encouraged him to tell us what had happened. It was strange enough that he hadn't immediately told us all about it when it happened a few days ago. Mentioning it at home previously, he'd nearly turned sheet white. We've all had crazy experiences living here, but this one really affected him strongly. As we drove through the dark, he told us his story, how he and another friend, both born on the autumn equinox, had a UFO pass right over them while stopping at a red light on Long Beach Island. While driving over the bridge from the mainland, they'd noticed multicolored lights a ways to the north down the bay, and both had the odd feeling the lights were speaking to them. Minutes later, they stopped at a light on LBI, and a huge triangular craft edged with multicolored light drifted low overhead. No one else in the other stopped cars seemed to notice. Later I was able to ask my brother-in-law, who was a mechanic for all the police on the island, if there were reports of this thing. None. But back to the time warp again, it took only 10 minutes for him to share this story. And as soon as he was done, we were all shocked to suddenly see lights, regular store lights, ahead when, by any calculation, we should have still been in the pitch-dark heart of the Pine Barrens. Traveling at normal speed, we arrived at the Wawa and traffic circle at the end of the road in only 10 minutes. This is not possible. The road usually takes a good 20 to 25 minutes, there's no way to do it in just 10. We experienced a sense of lost space, not lost time, if that makes any sense. I had something happen on a paranormal investigation at an old farm south of Charleston, South Carolina. The property owner had been having a lot of paranormal activity and was terrified of a specific corner of their property. When we went back to said corner, it was like I had traveled back in time. Where we were standing at the edge of the woods in a field, I suddenly found myself standing along a dirt road with an elevated wooden platform on the opposite side. I saw what I assumed was an African family being sold. The family was being separated. Father was sold to one plantation and, I assume, his daughter to another family. The scene lasted for less than a minute, and I was back in the field at the edge of the woods. After seeing this, I spoke to the owner, and the place I was standing was where 4 plantation property lines met. Knowing this, it made sense because neighboring plantations would often have slave trades or auctions at the property intersections, as it was close to all properties. After further investigation, I felt that it wasn't a negative entity but the father still searching for his family. I was able to communicate somewhat with the father and the daughter through different devices. Eventually I felt that I was able to reunite them, and the moment I felt them reunite, my entire group saw 2 large bright orbs come together and then go up to the sky. I like to imagine the family's spirits were finally reunited, and they were able to ascend. To this day, one of the coolest experiences I've ever had. Trees appearing out of nowhere? Something happened not long ago, and I need to write this down in case I forget, although I'm horribly disturbed by it. If there's a mundane reason for what's happened, I hope it's not because of some kind of health concern, because that would suck. There are 2 roundabouts very close together, maybe 200 yards apart, if that, which I have to drive around during the school run. They are slightly hilly, grassy verge-style islands in the road, with nothing otherwise remotely intriguing about them, or at least there wasn't until today. I drove over them on the way up, as usual, dropped my kid off at school, and on the way back, I noticed a copse of trees on the first roundabout. I thought, what is going on? Like, they were properly obscuring the view around the island and weren't there when I was driving to the school. A bit shaken, wondering what was going on, I got to the other roundabout, same story. The view was somewhat obscured by a similar, but slightly younger, copse of trees. I carried on past my exit, going back on myself to look at the other roundabout again, and noticed that on the way to the school, the trees obscured the view towards my exit. Normally there's an entirely clear, unobstructed view of this. I'm now sitting in the car wondering what exactly is going on. This was the most peculiar experience I have ever encountered, a memory that still evokes strong emotions in me. It was 2010, and I was 25 years old, living at home with my very supportive parents, who were helping me through college, after previously dropping out of high school and having 2 amazing children. It was an early autumn afternoon, around 4 to 5 p.m. I was in my room, doing some homework on my laptop and at my desk. The desk faced the wall directly across from my bed, and my older style box TV was on top of my dresser to the left of my desk, about 2 feet away. I was, as usual, procrastinating doing my homework, so I was mindlessly watching some dumb TV show. Because my TV was so close, I stood up instead of using the remote to change the volume on it. As I reached out my left hand to press the button, it was as if a switch flipped and my entire environment changed. That moment affects me still to this day. I still feel it in my soul that something strange happened. I didn't hallucinate, it was real. I was back in my childhood home, some 20 miles away, and seemingly 18 years in the past. I was standing in front of the only hallway closet in the one-bedroom house that I grew up in. The house was over 100 years old, and the closet had track-driven doors. You know, the ones that the doors never go back on the tracks, right? So you must be careful of how you open it. Anyway, the door to the closet was open, and my already outstretched left arm was reaching toward a very distinct item. When I was little, my mother had this perfume bottle that, for some reason, I was absolutely in love with. The perfume itself was cheap and didn't smell particularly good to me. The glass bottle bore the shape of a bird, possibly a dove. Its wings were up and outstretched. It was beautiful, but it had a broken wing. I probably broke it, being the curious and clumsy child I was, and still am. So, there I was, one moment in my somewhat modern bedroom in 2010, the next in the old one-bedroom hallway across the county, back in time 18 years. I was there, I saw the bird bottle. I was within inches of grabbing it. My heart melted for that dumb little bottle of stinky perfume shaped like a one-winged dove. Before my hand could actually make physical contact with that precious bird, the switch flipped again. I was back in front of my TV, outstretched left hand and all. My mind could not comprehend what had just happened, and I felt immediately sick and dizzy. I was in such a state of shock and confusion that I just walked out of my room, down the hall, into the living room, and out to the front yard. I could do nothing but lurch over, hands on my knees, and try desperately to catch my breath, but mostly my sanity. This experience was so jarring, so real. I was physically in front of that open closet, reaching for that damn bird bottle, and then I wasn't particularly stressed about classes, it was community college. I was completely sober and not prone to hallucinations when this experience occurred. I've only told a few people because honestly the subject of momentarily teleporting through time and space doesn't come up in conversation often, and I only know a few people that I can tell. Has anyone had anything like this happen? I still have no explanation, and it might have just been a weird break in psyche, but it was not a dream, and I was not under the influence of anything or under any unusual stress. Editor disappeared at Mount Rainier National Park. Joseph Wood Jr., 34, an African-American editor at the New Press, a New York publisher and former editor of The Village Voice, had flown to Seattle on July 7, 1999, to attend Unity 99, a national conference for minority journalists. He was a Yale graduate, and in 1990 he had received a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship, which enabled him to travel to Ghana and publish a book, Blood Whispers and Color Lines. As a young man, Joe was a keen lover of the outdoors and nature, and he joined the Boy Scouts, eventually reaching the highest scouting award of Eagle Scout. As a result, he had a very good knowledge of the wilderness. On July 8, 1999, Joe drove alone to Mount Rainier National Park to take a hiking trip and do some bird watching on the 14,411-foot mountain, 60 miles southeast of Seattle. He entered the park at 12:29 p.m., according to a car park receipt at the Nisqually entrance. He drove to the Longmire area and started his trek, heading toward Mildred Point. He was not equipped for a lengthy hike and was dressed only in a light shirt, wearing binoculars and carrying a bird book, as the weather was perfect that day in the park. Joe had a minor heart condition but was otherwise fit. He never returned, and no trace of him has ever turned up in the past 18 years. When Wood failed to reappear again at the conference, friends were surprised, though not alarmed. But when he didn't return to New York on Sunday, July 11th, his ex-partner Samini Sengupta, a reporter for the New York Times, who was also at the Unity Conference, raised the alarm. Samini and other friends of Joe traveled to Mount Rainier and followed Joe's route up the mountain. They tried to reach the place he was last seen, but the trail was still buried in snow, and rangers advised them to head back. By Tuesday, July 13th, Samini had filed a missing person report with the Mount Rainier National Park Service, and the next day, park officials found Wood's rental car in a Mount Rainier parking area. Bruce Gomond, a hiker, contacted park rangers on July 15th after recognizing Joe in a local newspaper story. Gomond said he had met Joe on the Rampart Ridge Trail at an altitude of about 4,800 feet on July 8 at around 2 p.m., and they had briefly spoken. Joe had asked whether the snow-covered trail continued much further. Bruce told him he'd gone up another 5 or 10 minutes but turned around at a snow bridge, which looked dangerous to cross. He was not on a main trail but was following others' footprints, the hiker said. Bruce came down the mountain immediately after their conversation. Wood's 3-hour hike took him through dense forests of western hemlock and Douglas fir with 4 to 6 foot high compacted snow blankets, which partly covered the trails. The Longmire area and Ramparts Ridge Trail are at the southwest side of Mount Rainier, crossing Pearl and Devil's Dream Creeks. At 4,800 feet, it goes on to 4 small lakes, including Squaw Lake. In the winter of 1999, Mount Rainier was covered by very heavy snowfall, but then, as much as 2 feet of snow melted in the warm and sunny days following Joe's disappearance, which meant that any tracks disappeared. The National Park Service organized search teams of backcountry rangers, firefighters, and volunteers. Squads with dogs moved out across the southwest face of the mountain while helicopters crossed overhead. On Friday, July 16, heavy rain fell, but rangers, encouraged by improving weather, decided to extend the search one day. They found no evidence of Wood, and eventually the search was terminated, convinced that Joe would have succumbed to the elements with his light clothing and lack of food or shelter. They believed hypothermia would have been inevitable. According to friends, Joe had a heart condition, which he only discovered a few months prior to his disappearance after a fainting spell in an airport. He had been considering getting a pacemaker. Given the excellent weather conditions on the day that Joe went hiking on or near the Rampart Ridge Trail, it seems very strange that he disappeared without a trace. If there was a snow blizzard or fog on the day that he vanished, it would be an understandable result of the severe weather conditions that can hit the Mount Rainier area. The snow melted significantly just after he went missing, so if he did fall down a ravine or a creek bed, he would be visible. So, if he had fallen into the river at the snow bridge, it would have seemed likely that he would have been easily discovered. Bruce Gomond, the hiker that Joe met, would have given rescuers a clear area to search in. There was no evidence of an animal attack, blood, bones, shredded clothing, etc. Was he killed or abducted by persons unknown? Perhaps, but there was no physical evidence recovered at all apart from his car parked in the spot that Joe left it. This story still haunts me to this day. I was in the woods exploring one day and came across a random old wind-up clock half buried in the dirt. It was probably from the 50s or 60s. I picked it up to take it home, wondering how a clock got in the middle of the woods. I'm in some deep woods that I explored often for over 10 years. I was on my way home when I came across a small cave that went into the ground, maybe 8 to 10 feet. I could stand at the entrance, but it shrank as I descended. I had never seen anything like it before, and I was so excited to have discovered something new and fascinating. I thought I'd leave the clock there, go home, and grab some materials to make the small cave fort, a chair, blankets, etc. I was even thinking of sleeping in it, which terrifies me now thinking about it. I was fearless back then. I mentally note the general area where the cave is situated. I'm familiar with these woods, so I had a good idea of where the general area was. I go home, but it's dark by then. I decide to return the following day. The next day I go back to the general spot, and I cannot find the cave or the clock. I spent hours looking, going in circles. I was so confused because it was large and hard to miss, which is why I was surprised to find it in the first place. I looked for that cave for years and never found it or the clock. I could never find the general area I thought it was in. This stands out to me because I vividly remember the cave. My excitement. My decision to make it a fort. Everything remains vivid to this day, even though it happened 20 years ago. I never found that or another cave in those woods after 8 years of searching. I have witnessed or been followed by an orb of light, and even years later, it still freaks me out. I and my friend used to love going on night walks when we were at university, in Exeter, UK. We would explore the city, the woods, the countryside, and everything in between. We used to do it all the time. On quite a few occasions we'd have strange and creepy experiences, but nothing ever quite affected me like this one. So, it happened about 3 years ago during our second year. There was a little hill/field near to our old first-year accommodation, surrounded by woodland that we would sometimes walk up during the night to stargaze and see the views of the city and the countryside. It was very peaceful and serene, especially in the middle of the night when it was almost completely dark. One night, we decided to walk there. We climbed up the hill and stood there, just staring at the stars and taking in the view. After about 10 minutes of this, I looked down the hill and noticed a small orb of light at the bottom. At first I just assumed it was an animal's eye, reflecting the moonlight. However, it wasn't blinking nor was it moving like you would expect an animal, or its eye, to move. As I looked at it more, I wondered if it could be another person holding a torch, but if it were, I would have been able to make out the silhouette of the person holding it, and, again, it was moving too fluidly and gracefully to be handheld, and it just didn't look like a torch. I nudged my friend and pointed it out to him. We both stood there, transfixed, watching it as it danced and bobbed around. Then, after a minute or two of watching it, it started to float up the hill toward us. The sight immediately made me feel on edge and uncomfortable, and neither of us wanted to stick around for when this light would reach us. We turned in the opposite direction and started walking back down the hill, towards the woods. We got about halfway down the hill until we turned and looked behind us. The light was now at the top of the hill, right where we were standing. The scene completely spooked us, and we started running. I had that awful, spine-tingling feeling, like something was about to grab me from behind, as we were running into the woods. Eventually we found the path that led back through the woods to the university campus, but the whole time we were walking back, we felt tense, like we were being watched. We were constantly checking behind us to see if the light was still there until eventually we got back to the comfortingly brightly lit campus. Like I said before, we've been on tons of walks in the woods in the middle of the night and never felt this spooked and unnerved. This would even be considered a fairly banal experience compared to some others we've had while out at night, yet nothing has stuck with me quite like this one. Years later, every time I discuss it, and even as I write about it now, I get the chills, I can feel my throat tighten, and my eyes begin to water. It's so strange, and I would love to hear everybody else's thoughts on this. One night, I had a big fight with my girlfriend at the time and went out for a drive to cool off. It was around midnight on a clear night. It was a full moon, so bright I could have turned off my headlights. I drove down a residential road that ran parallel to ours, the next road over. I had never actually been on it before and thought it was just houses. But before long I started to pass an old cemetery on my left. It didn't run back far from the road, just back to a line of trees. But it stretched a really long way down the road. In the moonlight, I could see the shapes of the headstones. There was a low concrete, or something, wall that ran in front of it with occasional gaps for entrances. It was so creepy, I thought about stopping to check it out but realized that's how many scary movies start out lol. I kept driving and looking at it. Near the end of the road, the cemetery ended, and there were a few houses before the intersection. I went back home. Like you, I thought I had been gone maybe 15 to 20 minutes and was surprised to see around 45 minutes had passed. The next morning I asked my girlfriend why she had never told me about the cool-ass cemetery. She said there was no cemetery. I said, yeah, there is. I'll show you. We went down the same road, and I even recognized some houses. But there was no cemetery. Not even a little one or anything that looked like one. Just houses. I spent the rest of my time in that town driving around looking for it, looking at maps. I was damn near obsessed. The closest graveyard was clear across town and looked nothing like what I saw that night. I drove through a glitch in the matrix. My mom and daughter experienced these events with me. About 4 months ago, my mom had knee replacement surgery, and they sent her home the next day. After 3 days her leg was red and significantly more swollen. She also had a fever, so we decided to go back to the hospital. This was around 10 p.m., and it was dark. I was driving, Mom was in the passenger seat, and my 12-year-old daughter was in the back middle seat. We live in a very rural area, and after about 10 miles, we hadn't met one single other vehicle. It's so rural. Along this stretch of highway, there are a few really tight curves that have a 30 miles per hour reduced speed limit sign. No flashing lights or anything else, just a yellow metal sign. There was a creek on one side and a steep cliff on the other, which meant there was no shoulder, no driveways, and no place for another car to be other than on the road, where we were. After the first curve, all of a sudden we see a bright blue light flash through the car. I saw it on the trees in front of me and behind me when I looked in the door mirror, and then it was gone. Like cop lights, but without any red or headlights behind us. Just for 1 second. No sound. No other cars in front of or behind us, and we're only going 30 miles per hour. All three of us saw it. The exact same thing. It really freaked me out because I'm a very logical, rational person, and I can say this is the only experience I've had my whole life that I can't explain. Additionally, a tractor trailer crashed into 2 wooden crosses beside the road, resulting in the deaths of 2 people. I remember that accident because it tore up the highway where the semi jackknifed, and that section had to be repaved. I don't believe in ghosts or aliens. If my mom and daughter hadn't seen this too, I would have convinced myself I was seeing things and probably never even mentioned it to anyone. So my theory is, we drove through a glitch in the matrix and saw the emergency lights from that accident years ago. As crazy as that seems, It makes as much sense as anything else I can think of. What do you guys think? Has such an event happened to anyone else? When I was about 17, I went on a day trip with my mother to a beach we'd heard about. She knew how to get most of the way there, so she memorized the last few MapQuest directions instead of printing them out. The entire route is almost entirely made up of farmlands, with long, straight roads and few intersections. We drove through farmland for 30 minutes, expecting to intersect the town's main road, but we didn't find any intersections. Finally, we pulled into a gas station to ask how to get to the beach. The cashier pointed the way we came and said, "Take this road, you'll drive straight into the lake." We hesitantly drove the way she told us even though it was precisely the road we came from, and after a minute or two of driving straight, it was an entirely different road. Instead of wide open farms we'd seen the whole way here, there were now churches and houses and yard sales and banks and traffic lights, and sure enough, less than 10 minutes later, the road ended at a T, looking straight out over Lake Ontario, hard to miss. After a moment of absolute confusion, we assumed that we had somehow merged onto the road at an angle without realizing it. Later at home I looked it up on maps. There are no slanted intersections between the beach and the gas station, only a handful of perfectly perpendicular intersections with either traffic lights or stop signs. Not only that, but a creek runs parallel to the main road, so we would have had to cross a bridge to get there. We did not cross a bridge. The creek is quite wide, so we should have noticed if we had crossed. We turned right without realizing it even though we were on alert and checking every street sign for the main road, and our destination was to the left, so we had no reason to turn right. I think it was an illusion of unfamiliar territory. My mom still tells that story. Despite being a strong skeptic, it's pretty tame but still the most unexplainable thing that's ever happened to us. We've gone back many times since and never found anything that could have caused the confusion. If anyone wants to check it out on maps, the town is Olcott on Lake Ontario in NY. The road is Route 78, and the gas station is Kenyon's. We were coming from the west, and the end destination plugged into MapQuest was Olcott Beach Lighthouse. I don't really know what to call this. A glitch, a time slip, or just a weird coincidence, I'm really not sure. I'm from West Yorkshire, UK. I am a 27-year-old woman, and this happened in 2010 when I was 15, and I remember it as if it was yesterday. Here's my story. I, my mom, grandma, and friend all went to a local coastal town for the day. Somewhere we had been many times before, at least 3 to 4 times a year because we have family who live there. We have always traveled the same route through the countryside rather than the motorway because we like to stop off at what we call a halfway house to grab a sandwich on the way there and a drink on the way back. We always stop at the same places because it's just part of the routine and what we have always done and enjoyed. On this particular day, everything was normal. We had driven to the coast, stopped off for a sandwich, the sun was shining, and it was a normal, lovely day. However, things took a turn for the worse on the way back. We set off mid to late afternoon because we wanted to miss all the evening traffic and to make sure my friend got home at a decent time. The journey felt normal. We traveled on the same roads as we always had and were planning to stop off at the usual pub for a drink, non-alcoholic. In the space of about 5 to 10 minutes, we noticed the weather had really changed. It had gone from being a glorious, warm, sunny day to being gray, overcast, and freezing. We didn't think much of it, and then my mom said, "Oh, I don't know where I am." Confused, we just said she must have taken a wrong turning, but she was adamant that she had been on the same road for the last 8 miles, a road we had traveled countless times. We wondered if the road had been altered since the last time we visited because now, none of us recognized the road or the surroundings. We looked for a familiar landmark that would hopefully guide us in the right direction, but there was nothing but fields for miles. We began to notice that the road we were on was very quiet, and we seemed to be the only car driving along it. No other vehicles had passed us for what seemed like ages. I and my friend began to get anxious because of how weird this felt, and we were worried about being lost. My mom calmed us down and told us not to worry and that the next village we drive through, we will pull over so she can set her sat-nav up. In 2010, phones were not equipped with maps or any other features, unlike what we have today. About 10 minutes later we saw a couple of houses in the distance. As we approached, we noticed there were 2 semi-detached houses, a small farmhouse and yard, an old-fashioned level crossing for trains, and a pub. My grandma suggested we pull into the pub so my mom could set up her sat-nav and we could have our halfway house drink while we were there to help calm our nerves. We entered the pub. It was empty except for an old man in a rocking chair in front of a burning fire. He stopped rocking the chair abruptly and stared at us as we walked in, as if in shock. He was wearing brown work trousers with braces, black boots, a cream shirt with a knitted vest, and a flat cap and was smoking a pipe. as if he stepped straight out of 1910. He didn't speak, just stared. We approached the bar. The barmaid/landlady was walking behind the bar and halted in her tracks as soon as she saw us, again as if in shock. We asked if the pub was open because it's so quiet, and she stuttered, "Oh yes it is. What can I get you?" We all asked for soft drinks, me and my friend being underage at the time, my mom being the driver, etc. The lady scrambled around getting us the drinks and then looked baffled when we tried to pay with bank cards. She used paper and a pencil to add up the cost of our drinks, so we paid with loose change to make it easier for her. To the right of us was a narrow staircase, and down ran a little girl around the age of 7 or 8. She was wearing white tights, brown brogue-like shoes, and a burgundy pinafore-style embroidered dress with a hand-knit cardigan, and her hair was in ringlets. She gasped, appeared surprised to see us, and glanced between us and the woman behind the bar, who was presumably her mother. We thanked them and took the drinks outside to one of the wooden tables. The man in the rocking chair began to rock again and watched us intently as we walked out. We sat down outside and, with hushed voices, spoke about how weird the whole situation was. We noticed how there wasn't anyone else around. There were no cars in the car park, no people in the pub or beer garden, and no people walking the streets near the houses. The place seemed deserted, abnormally quiet, and stuck in time. As we quickly finished our drinks, a man in a van pulled up. He got out, retrieved a pickaxe and spade from the back, glanced at us and remarked, "Ooh, visitors," before heading into the pub. We got back in the car as quickly as possible and left, and within a matter of minutes we were on a road we all recognized, and the sun was shining once again. The whole thing was so bizarre and unbelievable. It's all we could talk about for the rest of the journey home. We were trying to understand the situation. The unrecognizable roads, the old-timey clothes, the overall feel of the place, and the people's reaction when they saw us, as if we were aliens, dominated our conversation for the rest of the journey home. So that's my story. The memory of it all is still so clear, and I'll never forget the expressions on their faces. We still talk about it to this day, 12 years later, all our memories so clear. It was possibly the strangest experience of my life, and I felt like I wanted to share my story here to get others' opinions and see if anyone had experienced anything similar. Thanks for listening. The path that wasn't there. I have 2 huskies and a shepherd mix. We go about 5 miles a day, usually in the local metro parks. Every park has at least one path that allows pets, so we can go to a different path every day of the week. I enjoy observing the changes in the forests and fields from week to week and season to season. Right now the leaves are just starting to turn and drop, but the foliage is still full and lush, and many plants still flower. We've had a lot of rain, and our soil has a lot of clay, so when it's wet, it's quite slick. The path we walk today is unimproved, which means they mow it, but that's all. In many places, it's bare earth. It's relatively hilly, and there are several small creeks flowing into a river, so in places it gets rather boggy. People lay down branches to make a rough sort of corduroy that squelches and shifts as you put your weight on each branch, but it's still better footing than wet clay. Today I carried a 35-pound pack, training for an overnight backpacking trip in spring, so as we traversed a slippery spot, I focused intently on keeping my footing and keeping the dogs from pulling. A couple of months ago, I slipped on this trail, falling to one knee, and the weights in my pack repeatedly collided with my head, causing a minor headache. No harm done, just a mild headache for the afternoon. But I have learned about gravity and inertia and would like to avoid further lessons. Sort of in the background, I noticed we had reached the part where the trail forks. I could see the path to the left where the grass starts to grow and the footing quickly improves, but I was still intent on not slipping in the mud. That's not the way we go, I remember thinking, and I kept going. The dogs happily led the way down our usual branch. The sun shone, the insects strummed, and the birds chirped, all was well. A few more steps, and it felt like I came back to myself. You know that feeling when you've been focused on something small and then become aware of the rest of the world again? I paused. Wait. Something wasn't right. A fork in the path? This trail is 3 circles connected by straight stretches. When you finish a straight bit, you can go left or right, and then you get to the next straight bit, and you can keep going, or you can follow the circle back around. It's a nice setup because it's not just out and back, and you can choose how far you want to go. There are little maps at every branch. However, we were still in the first straight section and had not yet reached the first circle. The path does not have a fork. I stopped and looked back. We had come around a curve, and the leaves are thick enough you can't see through them. In my mind I could clearly see the grassy fork heading slightly uphill into a sunny clearing just on the other side of the curve. I could see the branches of the little maple sticking out, So you either had to duck under or step around. I had completely accepted the scene as normal when we passed it. And I knew it did not exist. I took a single small step backward. The dogs stayed where they were. The shepherd whined. All my instincts cried no, and my entire body broke out in gooseflesh. The sun still shone, the insects still strummed, and the birds still sang. It wasn't a cold, dark, foggy, or ominous feeling. Just a lovely late summer day. If I went around that curve, would I see the new path again? What adventure waited for us just a few steps ahead? I decided not to find out. Time slip? Aliens? A weird walk down the block. Last weekend, my partner and I were walking home from the grocery store. It's about 5 to 6 blocks from the store to our house, along a fairly busy main road. We are walking and happily chatting, and we both start smelling the strong smell of pipe tobacco. We start talking a bit about how we like the smell of pipe tobacco and how it reminds us of a night we had way back when we started dating. We are also both looking around to try and find where the person smoking a pipe is. To our surprise, it is 2 men smoking cigars on the side of the road. It seemed a bit weird, but oh well, I suppose a cigar and a pipe can smell the same? We pass them by, and they both look at us. As we pass them, everything goes a bit weird. They started saying vaguely aggressive things, I can't remember exactly now, but it was something like "my God," in plain daylight? And we both felt it was directed towards us, so we didn't look back and kept walking. At this point we both realize everything has gone hushed and there are no cars passing us by. The cars up ahead aren't moving, and the main thing we can hear is a cafe at the end of the block playing some sort of French piano music at the top of the street. Someone on the other side of the road, that we can hear but not see, is completely freaking out, screaming, and just going mad. Everything felt so deeply unsettling to both of us, and we commented on the quiet and how it's so odd. We reach the end of the block where the cafe is, and it's like we have been thrown into a wall of noise. We hear the cars, and they all start moving past loudly. Bikes start going by, ringing bells, and basically all the city sounds come back in full force. It was so incredibly jarring to go from this unnaturally unsettling quiet to everything back to normal suddenly. We spoke about it, and both experienced the event in the exact same way. I also had an inexplicable feeling that we had been in a different time for that moment. Not sure why it was just a feeling. We walk home feeling a bit unsettled. We also passed 2 guys on the street who looked exactly the same, with messed up, freaky, inhuman faces, that gave off extremely aggressive vibes. We again had the same feeling of this isn't right, but maybe it was because we were already feeling weird, and it was a few days before Halloween after all. We got home, and our son acted like we had been out for ages. I checked on my phone when we had checked out at the grocery store, and the walk that usually takes 10 minutes took over 30 minutes. I don't know what happened, but even a week later, I feel shaken by it. I actively avoided walking down the same block during this week. It seems so small, but we were totally freaked out by it. It all just felt so wrong and sinister. Has anyone ever experienced anything similar? Any theories? Can't get it out of my head, and it's so weird that my partner and I experienced it all in exactly the same way. There's a little urban park near where I used to live in Manchester. My girlfriend and I were walking down a sunny path chatting when we suddenly stopped dead in our tracks, feeling a great fear/heaviness, and both stared at a black gap in the hedge where the feeling was coming from. If you know the scene in The Fellowship of the Ring where the Black Rider was approaching and the camera zooms in, kind of a fishbowl effect, it was a bit like that, though less dramatic. We both said, "Do you feel that? How weird. It's like there's something in there." It was so strange, as we don't do that kind of thing, and there were no preceding thoughts. It was a sunny day with people around, and we weren't speaking about spooky stuff. I convinced her to go through the gap, into a dreary clearing between dying moss-covered trees. We found a wicker basket set in a hollow where 2 trees crossed. We were both feeling very strange, she was actually terrified. Bear in mind this is a sunny Sunday afternoon. Then we found an antique china doll's head below the basket with white feathers and cigarette butts, as if people had gathered around it. My girlfriend said, "I think the feathers are stuffed in the doll's head. Can we go?" We were both weirded out by the feeling and the find. It felt like the place had a very heavy negative energy. Like a ritual had been performed. I went back looking for this location many times over the years to validate this and could never find it. Even immediately afterwards. It's not a massive park but very meandering. It was pretty strange, it was almost like stepping out of the regular world. I've always felt I could get unusually lost in this place despite the size and used to try to do so on purpose. I guess things get overgrown quick, and maybe it's still there, but it stayed with me. I've never had that feeling before, we both felt it, it was so sudden and oppressive. Perhaps a minor story, but one of many about weird forests, prevalent in old folklore as well. I have no idea what we just saw in the NM wilderness, but it was weird. It was truly bizarre, and I can't for the life of me figure out a satisfactory explanation. I'm interested if anyone has any idea what we could have seen or has experienced anything similar. My fiancée and I just concluded an awesome road trip from Austin to Albuquerque and back. As a native of New Mexico, I wanted my fiancée to meet my family in Burke and see the high desert, which I love. We decided to take the route that goes through Lubbock and Clovis in eastern New Mexico. We wanted to at least hit Route 66/I-40 before bed, but an hour out of Clovis we started to get tired. It was 1 a.m., and we had been driving all day, so we decided to sleep. I was riding bitch, so clearly it was my sworn duty to find us a campsite, and as my fiancée's unofficial guide, I was also determined to find somewhere that was representative of New Mexico's natural beauty. We're avid outdoors people and fishermen, so Lake Sumner was right off our route and the perfect choice. So I make a reservation online, and we detour down a dark road in the remote desert about 6 miles off the highway until we hit Lake Sumner and roll our little truck into the car campsite. We have a camper set up in the truck bed, complete with a comfortable air mattress, making setup effortless. I had picked the corner site for privacy, and damn, had it paid off. Since it apparently rained for days before we arrived, it's pretty cloudy, and we can't see the stars. However, we do have the perfect view of the black expanse of the lake over the shrubby tree line. The entire campsite is nearly empty when we arrive. It's cold, it's quiet, it's vast and empty, and it's so peaceful. I'd somehow never made it here in my whole 20 years in the state, and it was everything my heart had wanted. We grabbed our pajamas out of our suitcases, and my fiancé settled down on his tailgate to eat tasty, albeit somewhat cold, leftovers. I'm grabbing my candy from the passenger seat door when I hear him say, "What is that?" "What is what?" I asked, but I wasn't really paying attention because Sour Punch straws. "There's a weird light out there." "Huh?" I tell him it's probably just people with flashlights down the way. But he says, "No, it's moving up and down really fast. And it's above the tree line." I go and take a look, even though I'm pretty sure it's just a headlight or something. But he's right. I see a soft yellow circle of light. It's clearly not on our side of the lake because it's visible above the line of trees. I watch it as it moves quickly from one end of the landscape to the other before bobbing downwards and disappearing behind the shadow of a tall tree on our side of the water. Then, even more weirdly, another one appears on the opposite side of the lake and starts moving as well, independently from the first. That's when I finally agree that yep, this is odd. At that point, though, I'm still feeling like there is a mundane explanation. Neither of us has ever been to Lake Sumner before. The size of the lake is unknown to us, and the darkness prevents me from seeing much beyond the shoreline's tree line. But when we awoke the next morning, the daylight finally revealed the size of the lake and the true distance of those orbs, a moment that left me in awe. They were above the tree line but still disappearing behind the tallest trees. That means that the lights were almost certainly above the water. And the way they were moving, up, down, side to side, sometimes incredibly quickly, makes absolutely no sense for how far away they were. I can't think of a logical explanation. A boat can't move like that. A human can't move like that. A car can't move like that either, and if it were a car, then we'd see two headlights moving in tandem. Furthermore, the lights didn't look like standard lights, they had a soft glow and were a distinct, deep yellow color. The quality of the light was nothing like an LED. My best guess would be some soft incandescent bulb, but it didn't look quite like that either. It was pretty far away, though. And if, somehow, it was two people with flashlights on the other side of the lake like I originally thought, why the hell were they on opposite ends of the lake from each other? And how the hell did they manage to jump so high in the air that it was a visible up and down motion to us a mile away? There is absolutely no way a human being could jump like that. It doesn't fit our observation. To make it weirder, my partner later elaborated that, before I came over to look, he saw the light go into the water. I didn't see this, but I believe him. He's not the type to embellish or jump to illogical conclusions. I'm just absolutely stumped, and I have no logical explanation apart from ball lightning or Marfa lights, which don't exactly fit as a likely scenario either. If you've read this far, I appreciate it. Please tell me someone else has experienced something like this in that area so I feel less crazy. If my boyfriend hadn't been there and seen exactly what I had, I think I'd be utterly freaked out. Currently, I'm deeply curious and eager to find a suitable explanation. A strange event happened to me that I can't shake. I am still wondering whether I should share this or not. I experienced a time slip, and it's as puzzling today as it was then. My sister and I parked outside my parents' house. She left the car to head inside, and as she did, I looked at the car dashboard, and it was exactly 1 a.m. That's the last normal moment I remember, because what happened next is something I still don't have an explanation for to this day. I am suddenly on the street where I live, which is about a 25-minute drive from my parents' house. I wasn't right in front of my house, but close enough to see it. I could hear people cheering loudly in the background, like I'm in the middle of a live World Cup soccer game. To my left, there was this orange, energy-like orb floating near the ground, almost as if it was going to race me. And on my right side, I'm looking, and I'm seeing an old man in a huge, long, weird, kind of magician-looking robe. He was counting down loudly, starting from 5. Down to 1. And I swear on everything that is dear to me, I still remember when he was counting down. 5, 4, 3, 2. And when he came to 1. And said it. 1, bam. I hear this loud bang on my car window, and I'm looking around, and I see a cop pointing his flashlight at my face and shouting, "Are you sleeping behind the wheel? Get out of the car now." Now, I'm looking at this police officer and realizing that I'm literally in front of a police station, right on the road, with my car still in drive mode. This police station is about 25 minutes from my parents' place and maybe 5 minutes away from where I live. I looked at my dashboard, it was 5 a.m. 4 hours just disappeared like that. And there I was, sitting in the driver's seat and just looking at the officer, shocked. The officer is asking me all these questions. Why am I here? Where are you going? Did you sleep? Are you on drugs? Etc. And I am just completely flabbergasted. I'm looking around, both at the officer and at my surroundings. And as if I noticed that there were no cars, no people, and nobody in sight, I was literally standing on the road in the middle, exactly in front of the police station. 4 hours later. The experience I had with the old man and the orb lasted a mere 5 seconds, at least in my mind's perception. I'm at a loss as to how I managed to lose 4 hours. I look at my phone and see that I got like 100 missed calls from my wife, maybe another 100 from my parents, and various other calls from friends that my wife had woken up in the middle of the night to ask if they know anything. I don't know whether I should go on or not. I've been thinking about this every single day, and this happened to me 10 months ago. And until this day I still can't find an answer to what happened. Whenever I tell someone, they look at me like I'm crazy or possessed. If anyone knows anything or how, please share it with me, as I am eager to find answers. Thank you, guys. Bright purple light in the middle of the woods. My parents own a small cabin in the middle of the woods on about 60 acres of land in upstate New York, rural Sullivan County, to be a bit more precise. We call it, rather appropriately, the camp. The small cabin at the camp is nicely nestled in the middle of the woods. There is a mile-long dirt road also surrounded by woods that leads to a small dirt lot and a small yard in front of the building. We use this road to get to and from the camp. Behind the cabin is a clearing that is about 350 yards long and about 60 yards wide. The clearing consists of the backyard, the garden at the end of the yard, and a small field directly behind the garden. Other than that, the rest of the property is all woods. We have thoroughly explored the woods, yet they remain a vast expanse. The small cabin is made up of only 2 rooms, with one room used as the bedroom and the other room used as the living area. There is only one inside wall within the cabin, its purpose simply being to divide the 2 rooms. Other than that, the 2 rooms are completely open. The cabin had simple furnishings. In the bedroom there was a bunk bed and a sofa couch. In the living area there was a love seat and a sofa couch, a wood stove, 2 dressers, a coffee table, a rocking chair, and a small TV. That's it. There is no kitchen or bathroom available. We used a gas-powered generator to run the few lights and outlets within the cabin, as well as the TV. We had a VCR hooked up to the TV and would occasionally watch movies on VHS or DVD. For those concerned about the bathroom situation, there was an outhouse about 30 yards from the cabin. To cook, we either used the wood stove inside the cabin or the propane grill on the small porch overlooking the backyard. The cabin has multiple windows. There is a fair-sized window that allows us to view the front yard, another fair-sized window on the side of the building that gives us a view of the woods, and a large picture window at the rear of the cabin that provides us a view of the backyard, garden, and field. These windows are all in the living area. There are 2 small windows in the other room of the cabin, but they are not relevant. My younger brother by about 3 years, and my mother and father spent just about every weekend at the camp when we were younger. Simply put, we grew up in the woods, and we were certainly no strangers to the outdoors. With that being said, I have had my share of experiences, most of which have had logical explanations. However, the event that you're about to read about stands out because to this day, not one of us can explain it. This incident took place in the summer of 2008. I was 9 years old at the time. It was a perfectly normal Saturday in June. My brother and I carried out our normal routine of riding four-wheelers, playing outside, catching frogs, and catching salamanders, nothing out of the ordinary throughout the day, as you would expect. Towards the evening, it started to get chilly, so my little brother and I decided to call it a day and head inside the cabin for the night. I gassed up and started the generator, and we went inside for the evening. Once inside, I filled the wood stove and started the fire to get some heat going, as it was going to be a rather chilly night. My dad had just finished grilling the usual chicken, potatoes, and burgers, and he brought the food inside around 7 p.m. We all ate and relaxed for a little while to let our food settle. The sun had just started to set. Fast forward about 30 minutes, and I began to get bored. My mother then reminded me that she had brought my plug-and-play Wheel of Fortune game with us for us to play. I excitedly went ahead and plugged the RCA cables into the TV and set up the game. The TV was situated just to the left of the big picture window at the rear of the building. It was dusk at this point. By dusk, I mean it was getting darker, but there was still plenty of light to see outside. It was about 8 p.m. at this point, and in upstate New York, it isn't pitch black outside until around 9:30 p.m. in the middle of the summer. So, there was still plenty of light outside. We had been playing Wheel of Fortune for a few minutes at this point. I sat in a rocking chair, just a few feet away from the TV. My mother handed me the game back for my turn when the incident occurred. Just as I spun the wheel of the game, this brilliant purple flash of light emitted from behind me, at the front of the building. I turned my whole body around to see what it was and noticed that my parents and brother had done the same. I noticed that the front yard was engulfed in this purple light. We all watched this purple light come through the front window of the building. It completely lit up the interior of the building. We all sat motionless, moving nothing but our heads as this mysterious bright purple light passed by us, then proceeded out the back picture window and into the backyard, lighting up everything in its path. The light then sped off through the yard and toward the garden. We watched it pass through the garden, then through the field, and just like that, it disappeared into the woods. This all transpired within just a few seconds. I dropped the game as I was in shock. I turned around towards my parents and, already knowing the answer, nervously asked, "Did you see that?" They nodded and said yes in unison. My little brother ran over to the sofa my parents were sitting on and quickly sat between them. I quickly followed his lead. In the hours that followed, nothing else happened that was out of the ordinary. I asked my dad what he thought that purple light was. He told me that he didn't know. My mother suggested that it may have been lightning, which we all, including her, shut down as soon as the suggestion left her tongue. There was no way the light was caused by lightning. I have experienced many thunderstorms in my life, even at 9 years old, and no bolt of lightning has ever come close to replicating that bright purple light. We all slept in the living area that night, my mother and I on the sofa and my little brother and my father on the love seat. We openly talk about that strange purple light to this day, and still not one of us has figured out what it was or has ever experienced anything like it again. We still spend a lot of our spare time at the camp, and as I mentioned, I have experienced many other things over the years, but never again anything like that light. I have searched for logical explanations such as ball lightning and have even researched paranormal phenomena, such as orbs, but nothing has ever come close to matching the appearance of that bright purple light that seemed to form from nothing. In 2020 I moved to Oregon and was staying at an Airbnb in Silverton. I and my partner at the time were driving down a long stretch of farmland at around 6 p.m. 5 minutes prior, I had seen something round and shiny slowly floating down into a tree line in the far distance. I don't know how I even spotted it, but I told my partner that I saw something that kind of looked out of place, a UFO. She seemed to take me half seriously, as she is as open-minded about ETs as I am. So 5 minutes later, while we're on the long stretch of road, I randomly had the urge to look to my left, and I saw a metallic, almost teardrop/egg-shaped UFO hovering over a crop field only about 150 feet away. I screamed to my partner, "That's what I saw." And we both sat there staring at it as we drove down the empty road until a line of trees blocked our perspective of it about 7 seconds after we first saw it. We were shocked and didn't know what to say, but I pulled over right after we lost line of sight and did a 3-point turn to go back. We drive very briefly and go to find out that it is no longer there. We were then mind blown, and we both saw the exact same object and its very subtle but unique looking characteristics. We seriously couldn't believe what we had just seen, and although we are believers, we were so amazed at how personal of an experience this was. A UFO is obviously making itself known. Since then, I have had many more encounters, both with others and alone, but none were nearly as profound as this one. Please let me know if you have any questions. Oregon staircases? I have been a resident of the Pacific Northwest for my entire life and was actively involved in the Boy Scouts during my childhood and adolescence. It's fair to say that I've spent a significant amount of time in the woods, much of it alone, from the southern sloping foothills of Mount Hood down through much of the Bowl of the Woods wilderness. I've also extensively explored the Ochocos, as well as the Willamette, Gifford Pinchot, and Umpqua NFs, and I have never encountered this staircase phenomenon. I have, however, had quite a few bone-chilling experiences on my solo trips, predominantly in the Ochocos. There is a particular spot I'm quite fond, and protective, of in the Ochocos that is a good 70 miles from the closest outpost and at least 30 plus miles deep on unpaved and barely maintained roads. I've had several unsettling and confusing experiences in this area. I'll begin my story from the moment I discovered it, hoping it will clarify why I'm seeking information about the staircases. The first time I found this spot was early summer, about 6 years ago. I had been scouting for epic spots to do a campout with a big group of friends and felt this was it as I pulled in from the end rim of the valley shortly before dusk. I pulled into the first spur immediately, made a fire, drank a little whiskey, crawled into my van, and was lulled to sleep by coyotes. As I explored in the morning, I discovered that I was in an old hunting camp, where a creek ran along the north side, under the road through a culvert, and to the south. WN the valley. It looked as if it hadn't been used as a hunting spot for some years, though. Lots of random plywood and boxes built for shitters. Timbers lashed in the trees for gutting games. Some random scrap. But no stairs. After breakfast, I found a large crosscut from a tree that was likely used as a firewood splitting base with, oddly, about 60 to 70 small stones and crystals, quartz, obsidian, jasper, etc., strewn about on its surface. Being the OCD bastard that I am, I spent about 30 minutes sorting all the stones by crystal/rock type into lines radiating from the core while drinking my coffee. I wandered around a bit and decided the spot would work for the campout and left around midday by the S exit from the valley down through BLM land into raw Oregon desert. I returned a few days later, and a couple of days before friends were set to join me to hold down this spot, thinking that I had found a spot that locals must surely know about that might start showing up on the weekend. I got in late and passed out in my van. When I woke, it seemed like not a single soul had been in the camp since I left. There were no tire tracks or fresh ash in the fire pit. That's when the weird started happening. I wandered over to find all the stones on that log I'd spent a good while contemplating and arranging were in complete disarray. I found it strange, yet not entirely implausible, that someone hadn't inadvertently wandered through and decided to trespass. The spot is a small valley about 2 miles in diameter with a rough dirt NF road running north-south down almost the exact middle. On the N, S, and W sides, hills rise about 500 to 700 feet a mile from the road. The eastern side of the valley has a small cliff face that falls about 25 to 30 feet, roughly half-mile E of the NF road, runs a few hundred yards, and then rises up into the eastern enclosing hills. It's an almost perfect little bowl. On the W side of the N South road, about also exactly in the middle on the east-west axis, a cattle fence has a 90-degree bend that shoots due W and south along a creek on the east side of the fence between the fence and the NF road, essentially slicing the SW 1/4 of the valley off into its own little fenced zone. A couple of small roads spur off to the E and W toward the S end of the valley. I spent the first half of the day exploring the valley's perimeter from the knee edge. The camp was near the N end, to the south end. Immediately, I found myself in a precarious situation as I had to duck under a large fallen tree on a trail behind my camp, only to discover another fallen tree concealed by the first. The second downed tree was not present when I had visited it a few days earlier, as I had engaged in the same activity during my initial exploration. It left a noticeable, exclamation point-shaped bruise on my forehead for 2 weeks. I found a couple of other campsites scattered about and a couple of roads that dead-end into nowhere spots that just end before the valley walls. I returned north to camp, ate some food, and then headed south again to explore more of the southwest pocket of the valley via a spur road. This road crossed a cattle guard and led me to the west side of the cattle fence. The Ochocos have lots of ponderosa pine, some of it is old growth and fairly tall. This particular valley has many trees that have split at some point, and several were fork-tipped. As I explored the S/SW part of the valley, I found 2 old ponderosa wrapped up like a corkscrew just behind a scraggly, gnarly-looking snag. Nothing groundbreaking, but from this moment on, my perception of this particular land began to change. I proceeded towards the western side of the valley, following a narrow path. At this point I noticed a hawk overhead tracking me. I turned around and found myself no longer on the road down in the SW corner, but about halfway back up the valley near the corner of the cattle fence that cuts due W about the exact middle of the valley that I had noticed earlier. I looked up again, and there were now two hawks. I felt a sudden sense of disorientation as I realized that I was now half a mile up the valley. I found myself situated on the eastern side of the fence. I use a compass when I need to, have an intuitive sense of cardinal direction, make use of landmarks, and generally have a strong capacity to navigate the woods and have often odd friends by taking them fairly deep off trail and navigating perfectly back to where we started. I've tracked an invisible trail through the bull of the woods wilderness, in the snow, for miles and miles and always made it home. Never in my life have I felt so disoriented in the woods as I did that moment, half a mile north and on the other side of a cattle fence in an instant. Something in particular about that SW corner of the valley is particularly bizarre, as all the other freakish experiences I've had out there happen in that part of the valley, in particular that gnarly Medusa-shaped snag, but I'll leave that for another time. Anyway, back to staircases, has anyone ever found them in the Ochocos? I want to know. I feel this spot must have some similar phenomenon going on. I can almost intuitively sense people have gone missing in that neck of the woods. Back in the 90s, when I was young and stupid and in the Marines, I had to drive from Chicago to San Diego. I had about 96 hours to do it from the start at Camp Pendleton when we were dismissed for the Thanksgiving weekend. I got a ride to LA with a squad mate and spent the night in Venice at his parents' house. In the morning I flew and met my sister in Chicago. We drove to my uncle's house in Iowa for Thanksgiving dinner. I met another uncle there and bought a car from him that he'd just salvaged and repaired. It was the first front-wheel drive car I had ever owned, and I had to learn a lot about driving in snow conditions. Later, I discovered that the car had some serious alignment issues. Unfortunately, November brought snowstorms from South Dakota to Oklahoma, resulting in the closure of interstate highways all the way down to Oklahoma City. The first stretch was across Iowa. About 20 miles from my parents' house near the South Dakota state line, I ran into snow. I spun out and blew a tire but somehow stayed on the road. I limped into my old hometown, broke into my parents' house, they were at the uncle's at the other end of the state, and spent the night. The next morning the service guy had to drive to Sioux City to get a pair of replacement tires for me, but I was off by noon. Interstate 80 was closed west of York, Nebraska, so I took an exit and headed south. I ended up spinning out and going into a ditch near Salina, Kansas. I got out to look at the tire tracks, and the front tires had passed within inches of a pole. I couldn't figure out how I'd missed it. A tow truck pulled me out, and I continued driving south. I drove down through the Texas Panhandle and then through New Mexico and Arizona on Interstate 10. By the time I got to the Arizona state line, I was hallucinating from lack of sleep. I recall seeing a giant humanoid striding across the highway in front of the distant sunset. In the middle of Southern California, I was drifting off to sleep, and I woke up hurtling toward the guardrail over a giant drop. I somehow stayed on the highway, again, I do not know how. In San Diego, I was pulled over by the police on suspicion of owie. I showed my military ID and told them of my adventures, and they let me go. I got to base around 3 a.m. but was so wired from caffeine pills I couldn't sleep. By the time of morning formation, I was still awake. My sergeant looked at me and asked if he needed to send me to sick call to see if I was fit for duty. I told him a very abbreviated version of what had happened to me, and he gave me the morning off to get some sleep. As an epilogue, the uncle from Iowa whose house I had spent Thanksgiving at died suddenly a few days later. He was reasonably young and apparently healthy, and it was a huge shock. At the time, I felt like my improbable survival from all my misadventures on the road came with those events as a price. Creepy experience painting a ceiling mural in Atlanta, Georgia. Time slip or something. I am an artist living in Charlotte, North Carolina. I paint ceiling murals for a restaurant group, traveling to different locations around the United States. I paint the script of full books on ceilings for this restaurant group. It's pretty cool. My wife and I were in Atlanta, Georgia, back in early 2016. She read to me, I wrote. We worked at night and usually got to the job around 6:30 p.m. I think it was the second or third week of May. We got coffee, went in through the side door, and talked until the last construction worker left. I started working around 7:45 p.m. I set up the ladder and primed a wall section above the bar area. I used a 3-brush, a gallon of flat, beige color paint, and set up a 9-roller. I started cutting the wall in and worked for no more than 20 minutes. My wife said she was going to change into different clothes in our van in the parking deck. I worked for another 4 to 5 minutes and put my brush down on the top of the paint bucket. Get down from the ladder to smoke a cigarette, and then all of a sudden I wake up lying on one of the bench seats across the restaurant. Looking back up at my wall as I stepped off the ladder was my last memory. The lights in the place were all flashing in succession with each other. I was scared. Like a scary movie. I didn't see my wife. I looked at my phone. 2.5 hours had gone by. I called for her, called on the phone, and got no answer. I immediately went to the parking garage, got to our van, and she was just waking up in the back of it in our little sitting space. This was not like us, we just don't both fall asleep out of nowhere, at the same time, no less, and we had been used to the work all night, sleep all day since February. She had looked at her phone and freaked out due to how long she had been asleep. She also didn't remember falling asleep, same as me. On the way back up to the job, I explained to her about the lights flashing, and we talked to the security guard, who reset/turned them off for us. He said someone had tripped the security alarm but was oblivious to who could have done it. The alarm system wasn't turned on because of the construction workers. We also used the back door a lot and never set any alarm off. Either way, it's just weird, it happened at the same time. But the scariest thing was when I saw my paintbrush on top of the paint can on top of the ladder. The brush was still wet. Flat latex paint dries up a brush in less than 2 hours in an air-conditioned environment. I put that brush down at almost 8 p.m. It was 10:45 p.m. when I picked up my brush again. My brush's timeline was only 5 to 10 minutes, whereas the time between putting down and picking up the brush was nearly 3 hours. That's the story. We live in upstate NY, a short drive from Lake George and the very popular hiking trail Buck Mountain. I have hiked this trail many times over the years, and the trail has never changed, so I had become familiar with it, even in the dark. Well, one late winter/early spring evening, my cousin and I decided impulsively to hike Buck for sunset. The trail was icy/snowy but obvious to follow. It is about 3 miles or so to the summit, with a little under 2K elevation gain. We got to the summit in about an hour. We took our photos, ate some snacks, and watched the light fade and the stars slowly come out. A huge full moon was rising that night, and we met 2 other guys at the summit who had come up for that reason. After a short chat with the other hikers, we decided it was getting late, so we should head back to the car. We put on our packs and started off down the trail, but after a few minutes we found ourselves back at the summit. Slightly confused, I shot my cousin a weird look and said we must have gotten turned around. So we turn around and head back down the way we came, following the posted markers on the trees and the obvious beaten path in the snow. A few minutes later, we are back at the summit. Again. At this point I was getting kind of nervous and had a strange feeling about our surroundings. As the more seasoned hiker, I maintained composure by suggesting that we might be mistakenly turning off someone's side path and looping back to the summit. We stop, make some more half-assed jokes to try and not show our nerves, but are still very confused and unaware as to how the hell we keep ending up back at the summit. Now I vividly remember trying to be extra aware of the trail and the trail markings. Ensuring this cannot happen again. Again, we turned around and began walking, this time slower, trying to be absolutely certain of our surroundings. After a few minutes of hiking. You guessed it, summit again. We had not seen or heard the other hikers since we had left the summit the first time. They had told us they would be leaving shortly after us. We waited a few minutes and got our hearing straight and, one last time, tried heading down the trail. The same trail we had been turned around on somehow. After hiking for a few minutes, I heard someone talking, and we found ourselves trailing behind the 2 hikers we had met on the summit. And so for the next 30 minutes or so, we followed them until we were absolutely certain we had made it past whatever loop it felt like we were stuck in. Still trying to convince ourselves that we just took wrong turns. Eventually we passed the other group and made it back to the car. Another weird thing. We took note of the time we left the summit. It took us over 2 hours to go 3 miles downhill on a trail that was very familiar to the both of us. Typically I am able to descend mountains much quicker than I go up, even in the conditions we had that evening. We did not feel like it took us that long to get back. Essentially, there is about an hour's worth of time that we can't really account for. You are welcome to ask questions. It was a very strange experience. I've never shared about it before now. My dad and I watched people disappear behind a tree. Last night, I and my dad were out on our porch, and I was going out every once in a while to ride my skateboard around when I wanted to. I ended up going back up to my porch to sit down and chat with my dad. We didn't discuss anything important, but not long after, we heard a group of kids walking around. About 30 seconds later, they emerged from behind our neighbor's house. They were still on the sidewalk, though. They walked on the sidewalk and turned and went onto the sidewalk my house was on. They asked us if we had seen a pit bull, but we hadn't seen a dog at all, so we just said no. They continued down the sidewalk and ended up getting close to the corner of the sidewalk. The corner of the sidewalk was blocked by a tree. I watched as the group had all been covered by the tree. I waited about 10 seconds later, and they had not left the corner. My attention to the tree was cut short as I had heard the footsteps of two boys also walking. They seemed to be following the trail of the other group. They got to the end of the sidewalk and walked behind the same tree. Sure enough, they hadn't come out from behind the tree either. I grabbed my skateboard and rode to the other end of the road to get a look at the corner of the road. I quickly went back up to my porch and asked my dad if he had seen the same thing too. He quickly said yes. Mid-conversation, I ran back down and followed the sidewalk on the other side of the road to see if they were still there. But they were gone. There may be a portal in my house. I believe in the paranormal but am skeptical about most of the stories people tell. It is extremely difficult to distinguish between a fabricated story and a true story when you can't see facial expressions or hear changes in a person's voice. Regardless, I figured I'd share my story to see if there are any other people with this type of experience. About a week ago I was sitting in my kitchen browsing the web on my phone. My kids had been asleep for about an hour, and my wife was in our room finishing a paper for work. There was not a radio or television on. While browsing in complete silence, I heard my wife cough several times. The cough sounded as if she had breathed in some water and was trying to get the water out. Jokingly, I jumped out of my chair and ran across the room to where she was sitting. I started patting her back and pulling her earlobes down. Again, in a joking manner. She looked at me like, WTF? So I told her I was trying to help since she coughed so hard. My wife, still with the WTF face, looked at me and said she hadn't coughed. I stood there and evaluated what I may have heard. I thought maybe it was one of my kids, but the cough was from a woman. It wasn't a 4-year-old or 1-year-old girl's cough. Other things about this cough are that it came from inside the house. It was the type of hack, like when water goes down the wrong pipe. It was one succession of coughs, about 4 together. How did the coughing not continue if it was that hard at the beginning? It didn't make sense then, and it still doesn't now. That's not the only thing that happened. Fast forward to the next morning. My kids are awake and eating in the kitchen. I'm in the living room watching TV, still waking and drinking coffee, and my wife is in our room getting ready for the day. All electronics are off except the TV and phones. My wife's phone rings from what sounds like the kitchen area. My wife runs to the kitchen to answer it because she was expecting an important phone call from work. My wife searches for her phone in the kitchen but does not find it. She asks if it was my phone ringing, but I told her no. My phone was in my pocket. Turns out both my wife's work phone and personal phone are in our room on the other side of the house. We checked the kitchen and surrounding rooms for anything that could have made the ringing noise but found nothing. I don't know the name of the ringtone, but it is very common for iPhones. My wife and I search for the reasoning of why we clearly heard a phone ring in the kitchen but cannot find a logical explanation. I was going to write it off as another weird coincidence, but I kept thinking of how clear the phone ringing was and how my wife heard it too. Add those sounds to the cough I heard the night before, and I started to worry that there may be an intruder in my attic. I don't think it's possible, especially since I have 2 small girls and a young boy at home. It's a slim chance, but I'd feel better if I just went up there and checked. I text my wife to watch the kids because I'm worried there might be an intruder in the attic. I don't want to verbalize it because if they're up there, then they'll hear me. I check outside and around the house first for any signs of a person being on the roof of my house. I look for cuts in the wall and see no signs of intrusion. I then grab the ladder to get inside the attic. The only way into this attic is through a small 2x4 foot opening at the top of the interior of a closet in one of the rooms. I grab my flashlight and my gun, set up the ladder, and intend to enter the attic as quick and as tactfully as possible. I don't want the intruder to be lying in wait for me. I push aside the drywall blocking the opening and hear a door swing shut. I say swing because it sounded like a door was on a hinge or hinges. I can't get the drywall off, and the element of surprise is now gone. I push through anyway and inspect the attic. The attic has no floorboard. You have to navigate through it by standing on the supporting beams. It is extremely annoying to have to go up there and do housework. I find no signs of someone being up there, no entry points, and no cuts in the wall. I came down and double-checked that my wife and kids had stayed in the living room like I had asked in case there was an intruder. She confirms their presence and the absence of any closed doors. I pretty much already knew the door shutting wasn't them because the sound came from the attic, but there is no door in the attic. I went through a checklist of logical explanations for the cough, the phone ringing, and the door shutting and have not encountered an explanation. I know it sounds weird, but a freaking portal is what I'm coming up with. I've lived in this house for years and I've always heard weird noises but never something like this. Most portal stories I've heard sound totally far-fetched. Usually a portal story includes a demon or something spiritual, but this instance was just totally random. People crossing dimensions to hang out in my attic? There's no malice, no sightings, no physical evidence, but the sounds were definitely heard and are unexplainable. I intended on sharing this story a few days ago but failed to do so. Partly because I'm always chasing after my kids and because I'm expecting a reasonable explanation to present itself. Well, that hasn't happened, and something else happened a few nights ago. It's about 11 p.m., I'm asleep in bed, and I am woken up by my wife shaking me. She tells me she heard a door shut. I say to her that it may be our 4-year-old, but she says she was watching the monitor and the cameras were on the kids. She said she had been watching the monitor because she had been hearing weird noises. I say maybe it's just the house creaking. She says she heard the windows shake. Now this is significant to me because we have some old windows. The difference between the old and new windows is that the old windows will rattle when a door is shut, due to air pressure, or when the house is shaking, earthquakes, and the new windows won't. So she heard a door close and the windows shake. That's enough for me to grab my gun and check for an intruder. I do an interior and exterior check and, of course, find nothing. I go back to bed and conclude there is a portal in my house. I wasn't sure if I should share this, but now I'm interested in finding information about portals or similar topics. Any advice would be appreciated. Lost an hour of time. I've had a few genuinely unexplained experiences that I've been dying for feedback on. Had a coworker a few years ago who was one of those overly responsible types. He consistently arrived at work at least 15 minutes ahead of schedule. Very put together, professional, and organized type of person. So one day she shows up to work 15 minutes shy of being an hour late. She walks in like nothing was wrong but made a joke about how she was surprised we were already there because she was always there first. She looked at her computer and started freaking out. Being a religious person, she suddenly jumped up from her desk in panic and exclaimed, "The devil. It's the devil messing with me." So obviously we were all freaked out now. She goes on to explain that she sets her alarm for the same time every day. She wakes her mom up, prepares her breakfast, gets ready for work, and watches the news, following the same routine every day. She said she checked her clock multiple times on her phone, and the TV said the same time as well. Her mom also saw it as being the same time she was seeing. She drove to work, and her car clock read the same time as well. But when she got to work, it was an hour later than every single clock she had seen that morning. No, it was not daylight savings time, which phones adjust for now anyway. And if someone that punctual and well put together was going to make up an excuse for being late, I doubt she'd make one up that made her sound totally insane. She was genuinely freaked out. She just somehow completely lost an hour, even though she swore every clock she saw prior to getting to work read the same time. It was just an hour later for everyone else. I lost 6 hours that I can't find any logical explanation for. It haunts me, and I need serious answers. 3 years ago, I was living in a house with my adult daughter, my cat, and her 2 cats. I went to bed early one night and woke up around 5 a.m., unable to get back to sleep, so I had a shower and started doing housework. After a few hours, my whole house was spotless, and I felt great. I made myself a pancake for breakfast and sat down to eat just as my daughter woke up and started rushing around getting ready for work. She had a 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. shift that day and had woken up late. At 8:45, she asked me to call her a taxi while she finished getting ready. At 8:50, I was putting my breakfast dishes in the sink as the taxi pulled into my driveway. My daughter asked me to feed her cats because she hadn't had time, and then she rushed out. I put fresh food and water down for my cat and headed to the laundry room in the basement to feed her cats. They had to be fed separately because my cat is a pig and will eat all the food. I filled her cat's bowls and put them on the floor. One began to eat right away, and the other begged for a morning cuddle. I picked him up and cuddled him for a couple of minutes, then put him down to eat and headed back upstairs with the intention of grabbing a nap for a couple of hours. I wanted to be awake before noon because that's when the cats all got their daily Temptations treats. To get to my bedroom on the second floor, I have to pass by the kitchen. As I passed, I noticed the clock on the microwave. It said 2:53. I assumed it had been unplugged at some point and was showing the wrong time. I was going to reset it, but I checked every clock in the house and my phone, and they were all the same. Even if I got lost in thought while cuddling the cat, it should have been no later than 9:05 a.m. I sat down stunned and tried to make sense of it, but I couldn't because if I lost track of time doing something I don't remember, there should have been evidence of it, and there wasn't. My house looked exactly as I'd left it when I headed to the basement, and apart from the confusion and growing concern, I didn't feel any differently either. At about 3:20 p.m., My daughter returned home from work and told me all about her day. I then shared my day with her. You left. I fed the cats. Then it was 2:53 p.m., and I don't remember doing anything else while you were gone. I experienced a time slip for the first time in my life. This event actually happened only a couple of days ago. I live in Prattsburgh, New York, United States. Just thinking about this story makes me feel uncomfortable. However, let's get started. It was an average night in my hometown. I just got done eating dinner, and I was feeling awfully tired. It was only 8:06, but I decided to go to bed early anyways. I slept really well, and I woke up at about 7 o'clock. I noticed something strange outside my window, almost as if the buildings in my neighbors' houses were slightly different colors. Then again, I did just wake up. I decided to have some Cheerios. I went to go get some milk from my fridge, however, I was out of milk. What the hell? I said to myself loudly. I was a little angry that I was out of milk, but I decided to go to Dollar General to get some more. I own a motorcycle and a car. I decided to just take my motorcycle, maybe some fresh air will help me wake up. When I got to the intersection, I noticed that there were no stoplights. There were just those blinking lights or whatever they're called. There were usually stoplights here. I tried to shrug it off and continued my journey to the store. The thing that I noticed was very odd. Even though it was supposed to be morning, it looked like the sun was high in the sky in the afternoon. At this point, I was approaching the street Dollar General was on. When I finally approached the store, I slammed on my motorcycle's brakes. There was a construction site where Dollar General was supposed to be. At first I thought, did they tear the store down? Why would they? There was a construction worker over at the site. I parked my motorcycle on the side of the road and went over there, not caring if I got in trouble for trespassing. This is how the conversation went. Construction worker: hey, you're not allowed around here. Me: dude, why are they tearing down Dollar General? Construction worker: huh? How do you know this is Dollar General? Furthermore, we're not tearing it down, we're building it. You need to get out of here now, this room is authorized personnel only. This is not exactly how the conversation went, but it was something close to this. When I heard the construction worker say this, I almost fainted. I ran from the area, hopped on my motorcycle, and sped off back to my house. That's when I saw another car in my driveway. I genuinely felt overwhelmed and anxious. I didn't have my phone with me at all. I got back once again on my motorcycle and sped off in the other direction toward Dollar General. When I arrived this time, the sky was dark, Dollar General was present, and there were cars everywhere. Everything was back to normal now. I stopped on the side of the road and looked at Dollar General. Suddenly, a state trooper appeared behind me, his lights on, and informed me that I was speeding at 65 miles per hour. I told him my experience, and I tried to convince him as much as I could to believe me. He just looked at me and said, "That's going to happen sometimes." I gave him my driver's license, he ran it through his computer, but surprisingly didn't give me a ticket and just let me off with a warning. It looked like it was going to rain, so I went back to my house. This time I asked a friend if he wanted to stay the night just in case something like that happened again. He stayed the night, but nothing happened. Ever since this occurrence, I always want someone to stay the night at my house out of fear that I might go through this again. It was extremely scary. Please share your thoughts, and if you don't believe me, it's fine, I don't control your beliefs. I am not sure if this counts, but outside of Superior, Arizona, there's a lot of land to off-road and explore. A lot of it you don't really have access to unless you're okay with being that person. Anyway, southwest of Superior is the Ray Mine, where Ray, Arizona, used to be. North of it is Mineral Creek and a large dam. So I have a relative who used to work for the mines, and he told us this story in the 90s about how in the late 80s, during a terrible rainstorm at night, it was his job to patrol the outskirts of the mine. He told us while patrolling the Mineral Creek area, he and his partner could hear loud noises that he could feel in his chest. They drive closer to the area, and the ground feels like it's shaking or vibrating. Not sure how exactly he explained it, he was speaking Spanish. Well, he says they pull up and see all these toads in the rain sitting in mud. They're the size of a Volkswagen VW Bug car. He swore these giant toads were coming from the creek, mud, or from underground. He expressed uncertainty about whether these giant toads were a natural phenomenon or a result of mutations from the mine. Mysterious phenomenon in the Aussie wilderness. I wanted to share a bizarre and puzzling experience from my teenage years. I should say straight up that I think the incident must be some sort of meteorological phenomenon. I just can't for the life of me figure out what. It was around 2003, when I was camping with a group somewhere around the Barrington Tops region of New South Wales, possibly near Timor Caves or more likely at Chichester Dam. I was about 14 years old at the time. Late in the evening, about 5 of us teenagers were sitting around a dwindling campfire, having a yarn. It was a calm night with minimal movement. But then, something strange happened. A noise started to envelop us. It began as a faint, ambient sound, something that could be passed off as the rustling of bushes and typical nighttime noises. However, it grew progressively louder and louder to the point where we had to almost shout to hear each other. Simultaneously, the surroundings started to brighten without any apparent source of light. It was like the ambient light became brighter, illuminating everything without a discernible origin. The noise and the light intensified to the point where we all panicked, fearing a bushfire. We even contemplated running to a nearby creek to escape the potential danger. But eventually the sound and light gradually subsided, returning to normal. It wasn't just the wind rustling through the trees, the sound was more like a mix of crackling, whooshing, and static buzz, and it was loud. There was no actual movement in the trees, no wind at all. There were very few clouds, and the moon was visible and dim. The light resembled the natural ambient light in the area but became progressively brighter and took on an orange hue, allowing us to see everything in the clearing and even a hill beyond. It was way brighter than a full moon and far less directional than any spotlight, more of an all-enveloping glow, seemingly from all around us. The whole thing lasted a couple of minutes. The experience left us all baffled, and we discussed it for some time afterwards, still believing we may have narrowly escaped a raging bushfire or something. However, when we asked around the next day, there was no evidence of a fire in the area. We asked several other people if they witnessed this phenomenon, but no one we spoke to was awake at the time. I still think about this mysterious occurrence from time to time. Someone must have a logical explanation or experience something similar. If you have any ideas or insights about what this might have been, I would greatly appreciate your input. Thanks for listening. Small town glitch. About 8 years ago I lived in a small town that was about a 45-minute ferry ride to Seattle. There was not a whole lot to do for a 14-year-old other than visit the local Walmart or go bowling. My days usually consisted of smoking a bowl or two after school with my friend, Derek, at my house. My house had a not-so-typical driveway. It was a long, uphill, gravel driveway with a pallet covering a ditch at the bottom of it. Across the street there was an older man who no one really knew much about. His driveway was basically the opposite of mine, downhill, paved, and a large overhang of trees. Being teenagers, we'd see how far we could go down his driveway before we got caught or before it got too weird. He had multiple no trespassing and warning signs posted on the trees leading down to his house, but we had never made it that far. On this particular day we decided to do something different. Instead of just sitting in my room after we smoked, we went to the bottom of my driveway and stood on the pallet, first photo. We watched as the cars whizzed past us, just enjoying the weather, when Derek started humming a particular alternative song that we both knew. I enjoyed this song as well, so I joined him and continued to watch the cars until we noticed a gold Toyota Camry pulling out of the driveway across the street. The man in the car pulled out, took a right, and stared at us as he drove down the street. Now let me assure you, this house had one way in and one way out since it was on the water. Now this is where it gets weird. After the man pulled out, Derek and I continued to hum but also chuckled, thinking he was only staring at us because we looked ridiculous just standing at the bottom of my driveway grinning. What seemed like 10 or 15 seconds had passed, and we spotted the front bumper of a gold Toyota Camry poking out from the same driveway across the street. The same older man behind the wheel was making a right turn, all the while staring at us as he drove down the street. I realized there was no possible way this could have happened, so I peered to my left to see if Derek had seen the same thing or if I was just losing my mind. Derek was not there. At this point, he was already halfway up my driveway, shaking his head and mumbling, "No ducking way." We went back up to my room in absolute disbelief. About 5 minutes after the incident happened, I could not, for the life of me, remember what song we were humming. Out of curiosity, I asked Derek if he could recall the name, since I could not. He sat with a dazed look on his face and shook his head back and forth. Derek and I, to this day, do not remember the name of the song but remember everything else that happened. It is definitely one of the most bizarre things that has ever happened to me. My 3 conscious abductions and close UFO sightings. I'm not trying to convince/debate anyone about what happened to me. I am sharing these in the hopes that they might inspire others who are struggling to share their experiences. Abduction 1. I am 17 years old and about to go to sleep. Blue light shines through my closed bedroom window, pinpointing my location. 2 small grays, they looked red in the dark, just appeared. One of them is facing me, while the other is heading towards the bedroom door. I can telepathically feel they're shocked I'm awake. Try jumping out of bed like anyone would, and I was frozen. Half my body was suspended in mid-air. They floated with me through the closed window, and that's where I blacked out. Went for regressive hypnosis to try and suss out some more details about this one. We attacked it from every angle for 2.5 hours, but each time reduced me to crying like a baby and whispering in sheer terror. My hypnotherapist rightly said, "I don't think exploring such an issue is going to help you." Abduction 2, 18 years old, awake with a jolt on board what I assume to be a craft. I'm lying down, head slightly elevated, and to my right is a tall gray. Telepathically I can tell that he is surprised I woke up and that I'm not supposed to. In his hand is a long and thin silver rod, looks like one of those old metal pointers teachers would use. Diffuse white light everywhere with no obvious source. They are completely paralyzed and unable to move. I felt less terrified than the first time, but I was still filled with fear. The gray communicates that he is going to put something in my ear, but it won't hurt. The rod goes pretty deep into my right ear, and I cannot feel a thing. Another communication informs me that I will go to sleep or something similar. Blackout. The next morning my body is electric, and it's all I can think about. I get out of bed and go to the bathroom, which is next to my bedroom. Put my finger to see if I can feel anything. I can't, but there is a bit of dried blood on my finger when I remove it. It would seem that anything as advanced as an extraterrestrial race visiting Earth would have the technology to not leave blood after an implant. But in a surprising number of cases, contactees report finding dried blood in their nose or ears after an implant. Of course, implants in other parts of the body also leave visible marks in most cases. The phenomenon does not make sense when we analyze the details from an anthropomorphic perspective. Abduction 3, 7 years ago I was visiting my parents in Washington State, which is where my previous abductions occurred, albeit in a different city. I awake again on board what I assume is a craft. Across from me is my infant son, just about 1 year old and smiling. He is sitting in what I can only describe as a futuristic high chair. It is molded to fit his body, white and very smooth, raised so that he is at eye level with me. There is some telepathic acknowledgement from him to between us is a purple sphere about the size of a basketball. Inside this globe is a swirling purple mass of what looks like gas or liquid. A bit like time-lapsed images of the sun, but smooth in real time. To my right is a tall gray alien. He communicates to me something like, "If you agree to this procedure, you and he, my son, will understand each other's souls." I have no idea what the gray is talking about and just stare at him. Apparently, this is an agreement, as the gray does something to this sphere but not physically. How I understand that he did something I cannot explain. Immediately after this, my son and I shoot down from Earth orbit through the atmosphere, cloud cover, and roof in the blink of an eye, but I am able to see it all flash by. We arrive back in the house, and oddly, my son is sitting upright on my lap, still smiling. I put him back to bed and then go to sleep myself. UFO sighting. I was driving along Highway 101 in Washington State after dark. The exact time and date are long forgotten, but it was between 1994 and 1999, a wide range, but a lot of weird stuff happened to me on that highway those years. At a certain spot, there was a farming supply store with a large field behind it. The store always kept the front lights on at night. On this occasion, while driving by, I saw a typical silver saucer floating behind the store. I'm awful at measurements, but it was maybe 20 feet off the ground. As long and high as a bus at its largest points. It's important to note that I did not spot the craft and suddenly pulled over. In some way, I was compelled to slow down as I approached the store, pulled up beside it, and there it was. In fact, during that 5-year span, I was compelled regularly to make a sudden nighttime 2.5 hour drive on the highway. I had places to stay on both ends. I'll spare everyone the autobiography of odd stuff. I only remember pulling up, seeing the craft, opening my car door, and standing up outside the vehicle. My next memory is waking up the following morning at my destination. This instance is one of those odd incidents where a person sees something unbelievable, remembers it fully from the time it happened, yet fails to tell anyone about it or even truly accept what has happened until later. I had a childhood full of the strange things that are markers for abduction, the kind of stuff most of us are already aware of, so I'll refrain from listing them. My boyfriend and I went on a hike yesterday at St. Edward's Park in Austin, Texas. We were there for about 3 hours. We climbed to the top of the hill, then walked down to the very bottom of the valley, went back up to the main path, and then back down to the parking lot. We got lost a couple of times exploring the different paths but eventually found our way back to the main path. The trails were steep at many points. We went into the bird sanctuary, where we saw no life. There were no bugs, no birds, nothing at all. We even sat in the dirt for a good half hour. I was worried about ants at first, but we literally saw and heard no life. On our way down, after we found our way back to the main path, we saw a couple of people walking alone. One was ahead of us heading back to the parking lot, while another was going up the hill away from it. It was already almost sundown at this point. It was about 6:30 p.m. The one guy going uphill we said hi to, so I remember what he looks like. He appeared to be an Asian man, possibly in his early to mid-20s, and was dressed in a gray t-shirt, thick-rimmed glasses, a black backpack, and gym shorts. Nothing to it. The distance from the parking lot is approximately 10 minutes. Remember, he's going uphill, we're going down. We briefly stopped at the creek and sat there for about 3 minutes, during which we once again noticed the absence of any life. There were no fish swimming, no frogs, and the area was completely devoid of life. We felt pretty eerie about this but summed it up to the city as destroying nature. We got to maybe 30 seconds from the parking lot when we saw the same guy coming from the parking lot. I stopped, turned around, and said, "Wait. No. What? Did we go the wrong way?" The tree line covers the parking lot even when you're basically standing at it. I'd been to this park multiple times, and I knew the parking lot was right there. My boyfriend said, "No, we're here." We got into the car and looked at each other dumbfounded and said, That was that guy, right? There's no possible way he could have made it back to the parking lot before us, especially without us seeing him. Even if he was running, we're both fast walkers, he would have had to have gone by us, and the guy hadn't broken a sweat. It was about 86 degrees Fahrenheit, 30 degrees Celsius, on top of being humid, as Austin always is. On our way home, a song came on, and I said, "Oh God, okay." I then proceeded to change the song. The next song to come on was called "Okay." At this point I'm broken, almost scared. I spent hours freaking out about all of this. I'm questioning everything. Nothing is real. What's the actual F going on? Strange paranormal tales of people almost taken by the forest. Throughout history, forests have always been places of wonder, mystery, and dark legends. These places have long drawn stories of the strange and mysterious, and they are often portrayed as menacing, with the feeling that something is hiding behind the branches and brush. For a long time now, there have been numerous cases of mysterious vanishings tied to forests, many of which have never been solved, and we are often left to ask what has happened. What if the forest has taken them through some means, and what if these places and their remote wildernesses draw people in to never return? There are certainly reports that seem to suggest this, and here we will look at cases in which people seem to have been drawn into these wild places, only to somehow manage to escape with strange stories to tell. Our first report of something insidious and hungry in the woods comes from a witness who says this very bizarre experience actually happened to her mother when she was just a 15-year-old girl. At the time, she apparently lived in a village in an isolated, wooded, mountainous area, and she would often go out with her mother or other kids to go collect wood. On this day, she woke up early, as usual, to a clear and sunny day for one such wood-fetching errand, along with a group of other girls from the village. However, this excursion turned out to be more ominous than usual. The poster talks about her mother's experience. She reported that her mother woke her up and instructed her to prepare for the wood collection. She got up, dressed up, and went outside of her home. The girls were waiting for her at her front door. Together they went toward the mountains. She said when they were going up the mountains, everything was as usual. The girls would sing, make jokes, and chat. As she was following the girls on a trail up to the mountain, her skirt was caught up by the bush. When she stopped to get her skirt free, she said that she woke up. There were no other girls, she was alone on the mountain in the middle of the night. She said that she didn't remember anything until after she woke up at her parents' house. A shepherd man found her unconscious and carried her back to her parents' house. She lost her ability to talk for a while, she said, because of the trauma. She said that all her hair fell out. I'm uncertain if this was due to the trauma she experienced. This story always scared me. Just what was going on here? Another report comes from a witness called Lola and seems to involve some sort of forest spirit, such as fairies. In fact, she says that the area where she lived had several locations that the locals called fairy fields, which they avoided and where people apparently got lost in places that it was impossible to get lost in. The witness asserts that the locals attributed this to the fairies instilling confusion in their victims' minds. She says she never really believed any of it growing up, but that one odd experience would change her mind, which she explains as follows. I am a fairly skeptical atheist, and I don't believe in this sort of stuff at all, but something odd happened to my brother and me when we were younger. We were taking a shortcut through the woods and fields near our home. We were about 2 to 3 fields from our house when it happened. We got lost. When I say we got lost, I mean we couldn't find our way out of the field. It wasn't that big, but we spent over an hour walking around and around the perimeter without finding a way out. We were beginning to feel a little frightened. My brother had already put on his jumper inside out, following the local folklore's instructions, when we finally spotted it, a large, wide-open gateway, untouched by overgrown bushes or brambles. Still don't have any idea how we possibly did not find it in 5 minutes. Was there a malevolent entity deliberately attempting to mislead them, lead them astray, or confine them? What fate might await them if they hadn't discovered their escape route? Who knows? Similarly, we have the case of Clavin, who says this happened when he was 10 or 11 years old out at Big Bear Lake, California. At the time, he was visiting his grandparents, who lived in a cabin at the lake, a place he says he visited several times a year. He explains that the surrounding forest had always been unsettling to him, with the constant feeling of someone or something watching him from the trees. Nevertheless, he often went hiking out there with his dad and uncle, and on this day they were on a trail they had hiked countless times before. They all knew the area extremely well, yet something odd was about to transpire. The witness explains. Anyway, my dad, uncle, and I were walking on a trail we've been on hundreds of times when we reached the first peak of the hill, where we usually like to stop and take in the view. My dad and uncle wanted to keep hiking for a bit, but I decided to go back to the cabin on my own, as it was only 5 to 10 minutes away. I proceeded along my usual path, not giving it much thought until I realized that I had lost my sense of direction. Everything looked the same as usual, but something was wrong. The normal path was different in a way I can't really explain. It seemed to be 10x as long as usual, everything was silent, and there was absolutely no wildlife around me, not even a squirrel. I kept having all of these morbid thoughts coming into my head about how I was lost forever or how some sort of creature was going to swoop me up. Every 10 minutes or so, I'd end up at a part of the trail that I definitely recognized, only to be in a completely alien area moments later. The path kept winding downhill, and the sun was setting pretty rapidly. It must have taken me over an hour to walk to the cabin because I kept checking my watch and panicking. At this point I just accepted that I was lost. I finally made it down to the street and was relieved to be able to orient myself, but I was surprised to find that it was only one street away from the cabin when I thought I had wandered much further. I was expecting my father and uncle to be home by now and for my parents to be worried about me being gone so long, but instead my mom asked me why I came back so soon. I asked my dad how long they were out as well, and they said they only walked maybe 15 minutes longer from when I left them. For another witness, Raven, it appears that something was trying to lure them into another place and prevent them from returning. She says that she had gone camping with her husband to a place she calls Deep Creek Campgrounds, and one day as they were exploring the area, they came to a secluded road and tunnel. They entered the tunnel planning to simply walk through to the other side, but a series of strange events would make that easier said than done. The witness says of all of this. We go through the tunnel. This is where it all gets a bit weird. What should have been a 10-minute walk turns into a 30-minute one. We're not panicking yet, but we're still stuck in this damn tunnel. We're filming and realizing the timestamp on the camera keeps changing. The phone is fairly useless but keeps showing weird times, notifications, etc. Finally, we reach the end, and I decide there's no way I'm going back. Here's our second mistake. There's a trail going across the tunnel. My husband wants to go back through, then meet us while I and our daughter go over the top to wait. At the top, the trail ends, which is unusual but not a big deal, as I can see the trail we came up on, and my husband will be coming up shortly. I take pictures, full panoramas, and everything. Never out of sight of the trail. Husband shows up, and we start looking around for the next trail or any trail, never going more than 150 feet in any direction solo while one of us stands near the trail. We decide we can't find it, we'll head back down the trail. The trail is now not where it was. But that's okay because I took pictures of some unusual trees and things, so I'll use them as a marker. When I open the pictures, I find that they are all timestamped incorrectly, resulting in different images. The entire skyline 100 feet away, mountains, etc., is entirely different. And now we start to get worried. We spent nearly 3 hours searching for a way down and a trail back, but we found nothing. Finally, we realize we're fairly screwed and start planning what we're going to do. At which point the glitchy phone gets a phone call, and we realize it works. We call 911, who puts us through to a ranger rescue team. They find us maybe an hour later, mere feet from a trail, and 1 entire mile from the tunnel. At this point, we continue our journey and make the decision to never hike again. What in the world happened to them? Did they perhaps pass into a vortex, crossing the threshold of an invisible veil to another realm? The situation becomes even more ominous when the witness claims to have discovered that Deep Creek Campground has been the site of several unexplained disappearances over the years. Was there a connection between these events and what happened to her? Also featuring some sort of similarly insidious presence is the report of the missing 411 case, which takes place in the wilds of Ontario, Canada. He says he grew up in a rural, rugged area of southern Ontario and knew the local woods very well from a young age. One summer he decided to go out exploring a stretch of woods he had been to hundreds of times before and knew very well, but on this day he says that he began to have the distinct feeling of being watched. As he continued, a sense of dread and the realization that he shouldn't have been there grew stronger. At the same time, the previously bright day seemed to grow darker, and the trees seemed thicker and more impenetrable than he remembered. Oddly, he began to hear the sound of what sounded like a bell in the distance. The strange sounds unnerved him, prompting him to head back home. He noted that his watch read 11 a.m. Yet as he turned around, he realized that he did not recognize where he was, and things would only get weirder from there. The witness tells his bizarre story as follows. It was then that I realized I had no idea where I was. Keep in mind that I knew every inch of this forest, from the roads that border three sides to the lake that borders the other. I had hiked every inch of it numerous times before. Yet, I had no idea where I was. Then, things started to get even stranger. I looked down around my feet and saw a number of metal buckets and various metal tools. That's when I heard a voice. It seemed like a child was calling for me by name. The voice was light and seemed to flow effortlessly on the wind. In my panic, I assumed it was one of my sisters calling for me to come home, so naturally I called my sister's name back. When I got no response, I took my phone out and tried calling, but this being the middle of nowhere on the Canadian Shield, I had no service. I looked around and out of the corner of my eye saw something dart behind a tree. I looked around me and saw lying on the ground among the buckets a rusted red bicycle, like one from the 50s you see in anti-nuke posters. The bike seemed to be staged in the forest's only light-filled area. I swiftly grabbed my camera and snapped a picture, unaware that my eyes were deceiving me. And then I heard it again. But this time the child sounded like they were almost singing my name, breaking it up into syllables. I started to quickly walk away, hoping that I would end up anywhere but this area. But the voice seemed to follow me, and I kept seeing glimpses of something running behind the trees, keeping pace with me, so naturally, I started running as fast as I could. I ran as quickly as my legs could manage, not caring for the branches that would whip me in the face and eyes. After about 15 minutes of running, things started to look familiar. I ran down a massive hill, and the trees started to become more open and brighter. I slowed down and started to walk, too terrified to check behind me. Once the feeling of impending doom settled, I finally mustered the strength to turn around. The moment I turned around is one I will never forget. I turned behind me, and through the trees, I saw my house, as if I had been running away from it the entire time. Thinking that I must have just gotten turned around and absolutely hating the idea of running back into the forest, I walked towards the house. When I was about 100 meters away from my house, I heard a spine-chilling shriek come from the forest behind me, similar to the sound of a mountain lion screaming or raccoons fighting, but it was far louder and seemed to be coming from not just one place but almost many places at once. I sprinted the final steps to my house and did not turn back. As soon as I entered the house, I came face to face with my father, who was sitting at the kitchen table. I looked at the clock on the wall and saw it was 4:45 p.m. The 5 hours that passed between when I took the photo and when I arrived home remain a mystery to me. All I remember is the 30 minutes it took me to get in, and around 20 minutes it took me to get out. Was this some sort of ghostly forest entity? If so, what did it want? A similarly ghostly experience happened to another witness, Lasley, in East Tennessee. He says that when he was 15 years old, he liked to walk in the woods around his home and had never seen anything particularly strange out there until one day when he had just a short walk through an area he had been through many times before. On this day he would stumble across a very odd place nestled out among the trees that he had never seen before on all of his hikes, and which would be infused with some sort of supernatural energy. He recounts his otherworldly hike. This time though, I decided to go just a little bit farther than I usually did, and my house had just left my line of sight when I found something odd. That something was an area of forest in which absolutely nothing was growing. There weren't any trees, moss, mushrooms, or anything. This area happened to be in the shape of a large oval, and I couldn't see any imperfections in its shape. There weren't any signs that it was man-made either. So, naturally, I just sort of stood there and marveled at the strange plot of land. Shortly after, the situation became much stranger. I started hearing some unnatural noise, and it sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at the same time. I could hear it right in my ears and from the forest around me, and it was getting louder. It took me a minute to identify the sound. It was a group of women harmonizing, at least that's what it sounded like to me. Now, by this point, I was honestly a little excited. Whatever was happening was obviously not a natural occurrence. I wanted to stay and observe, but I guess whatever or whoever was there was telling me to leave. The harmonizing soon filled my ears and was beginning to be painfully loud. In spite of this, I stayed adamant in my staying. Then came easily the weirdest part. I just bolted back in the direction of my house without warning. I tore through briars and mud, not even trying to slip past them, until I found myself in my backyard again. As I stood there covered in scrapes, mud, and trickled with blood, I realized that I wasn't the one that was moving my body. It felt as though my body was operating entirely autonomously. I knew very well what I was doing, but I wasn't the one telling my body to do it. I don't know, it's difficult to describe. Despite being scared, I stubbornly tried to find the spot again. However, despite spending a significant amount of time wandering through the woods, I was unable to locate the spot again. Given the occurrence of strange phenomena in the woods, it's unsurprising that hunters encounter unfathomable forces. Our final case involves a hunter named James Dalton. The strange experience began with a squirrel hunting trip with his father and brother, and on this occasion they had decided to split up and then meet back at the car just before dark. This was pretty usual for them, and there was nothing particularly strange about the day at that point. Yet, as the witness moved through a familiar area of the forest, he noticed a wispy fog seeping through the ferns around him, and the usual forest sound stopped. It was a bit disconcerting, and as he stood there, his ears began to ring for reasons he could not understand. Unsettled by this, he began to head back toward the car when he noticed something moving through the ferns toward him. At first he took it to be a squirrel or possum, but it seemed to be headed directly for him, which was very odd behavior for a wild animal and put him immediately on edge. Things were about to get even stranger still, as he explained. This behavior is extremely unusual for a wild animal. I thought that maybe it was a lost dog. I suddenly realized that the creature could be a rabid animal. At this point I lowered my shotgun and pointed it at the, so far, unseen animal. When I did this, the thing changed its direction when it was about 30 feet. It moved away from me and headed to my left. I never did see what it was and have assumed all these years it was something so small I just could not see it even though it was moving the ferns pretty well as it ran through them. Whatever it was kept going until it was about 50 feet from me and stopped. The ferns were only about 2 or 3 feet tall in this area and not very thick. I could never understand why I didn't see it before. I then walked forward in the direction of where this thing had come. I decided to walk to my right a little and in the direction of where my brother should be and just get out of there. After walking a short distance, I came to a very thick and tall patch of briars. The briars were about 8 feet in height and about 10 feet in depth. I remember thinking that I had never seen such a large patch of briars in this area before. I looked in both directions to see if there was a way to walk around the briars and could not see an end in either direction. It reminded me of a huge row of concertina wire from a World War II battlefield. My first thought was, oh well, I'll have to go back the way I came. As soon as this thought crossed my mind, a very ominous feeling overwhelmed me, warning me that something was not right here. At this point I decided, very uncharacteristically of me, to push through this patch of briars and get to the other side regardless of what it took. While doing this, I suffered severe scratches on my arms, but I couldn't resist the urge. I kept pointing my shotgun behind me with my right hand while pushing the briars away with my left, in case this rabid animal charged me again. Now I was surprised again. When I got on the other side of the patch of briars, the first thing I noticed was that the sun was out and setting low behind the trees. The sky was clear again. It's 5:30 p.m. now. I could not believe it had taken me 2.5 hours to walk 200 feet. I could hear birds singing and squirrels barking. The atmosphere was back to normal, and I knew everything was as it should be. Then I heard my father beeping the car horn, signaling it was time to go. What a wonderful feeling it was to hear that horn. I never did tell my father or brother about this experience. I am not sure why. Maybe because I knew it was so strange, they had to be there to feel the foreboding feelings to understand it. There is no way to know just how true any of these cases are, but they reside within an area of the paranormal in which there are many more like them. We are left to ask, what is going on here? Are these instances of portals or shifts in reality? Is it the result of spirits, forest entities, or other supernatural forces? Or are there even perhaps more mysterious forces at work? Do such stories relate to the many people who regularly disappear in forests? There is no way to really know, and such reports serve to tantalize and stoke the imagination. Disappearing gas station. A few years ago, I was on my way to work, a restaurant about 10 miles from my house. The area I live in is pretty busy, so for a few months, I had been taking a major highway to get there. On this day I needed gas, but there are no gas stations on the highway. I was pretty early, and I had a few extra minutes to spare, so I opted for my old route to work. The old route adds about 10 minutes to my trip, and I haven't taken it in a while due to the area's congestion. This detail is a little important. The route had many gas stations to choose from down a strip of road. Even though I had so many options, I decided that I would stop at the only Shell station. I had my radio on, and I was singing and enjoying my freedom for a few more minutes before work. Suddenly, I had this onset feeling come over me. I turned my radio off and, out loud, said to myself, "Watch, the Shell station will not be there." After driving about 2 miles, I approached the intersection where it's supposed to be. The Shell station was no longer there. This Shell station had been around for years. I used this gas station so many times, but never in my life had I thought to myself, how funny would it be if it was gone? I had so many different gas station options, but I chose this specific station. I predicted it would disappear. And it was. Side note, the significance of this detail in the story stems from the fact that I hadn't driven that particular route in months. If there were signs outside of the Shell station that informed customers of a demolition, assuming that there even were signs, my subconscious could have picked up on it or remembered. But I hadn't seen that station in months. There's no possible way that I would have known it would be gone. I'm not sure if I had intuition that day, rather than it being a glitch. Either way, it blew my mind. I'm either crazy or I rented a house in a straight-up evil portal. The Valley. Alright, I've been lingering about in this group, and I'd like to share my story. I've always believed in the paranormal until, ironically, I experienced it. I have since moved, and all is well again. Buckle up, we're going on a journey. To give you some visuals about the land. It was a crappy old trailer sitting on about 5 acres in a really beautiful valley in the southwest. There is a seasonal arroyo that, during monsoons, turns the back 3 acres into nearly a lake. The property's back half boasts a wooded ridge and mountainous terrain. Very rural. The location is approximately 9 miles away from the town, situated on the roughest dirt road in existence. As with most adults, I entered a period of life with some pretty big obstacles and struggles. It was a sequence of events that led me to rent this rundown pos. At the time it seemed serendipitous. An acquaintance had mentioned a property near her I could possibly rent for dirt cheap while we were hanging out under the new moon. Fast forward to the next new moon, this property owner contacts me. I'd told her she could give my details if it came up as available, and after some chatting, we agree to meet. This place was not the Ritz, not even a Hojo. It was a rundown trailer that hadn't been cared for in, probably, ever. I believe firmly in listening to my gut, but any red flags that came up were squelched by my excitement to maybe have an opportunity to pull myself out of the financial hole I dug myself into. He needed work done on the property and would trade for rent. I was swept away at the glimmer of freedom I was staring at. I hands down accepted the keys. Before moving in, I had to first clean the entire place. The cleaning process involved a significant amount of bleach. As I cleaned out several years of other tenants' belongings, I took note of how many sentimental items had been seemingly abandoned in closets. Some of it I set aside, with no idea what I'd do with it. It just felt wrong to throw it to the dump. After several weeks of bleaching and blessings, I was nearly ready. I invited a dear friend of mine, M, to come out with me to celebrate. While finalizing the cleaning and working on a broken water pump, the acquaintance, now neighbor, comes over with the entire family in tow, 2 small children, 2 teens, and a husband. The energy shifted in a way I could not notice. The husband was behaving off. He wasn't being social, nor was he being antisocial. I dismissed it with a positive attitude. It was discovered the keys had been locked in their vehicle, and he, the neighbor's husband, would need to go fetch the spares from next door. He invites my friend to go along with him, leaving me with acquaintances and children. We are chatting and listening to music. I knew a storm was coming, and I was feeling excited for an early summer storm. She, on the other hand, was becoming increasingly anxious. She has known to me, fear of storms. She is pacing with one of her smalls, looking out the windows for headlights. I was in the kitchen and she was on the porch looking for the returning men when there was the biggest, loudest boom I have ever heard. My entire body swayed with it. I said to the kids in the kitchen that Mother Nature was very vocal tonight and giggled to ease their surprise. The youngest child she is holding is screaming, and she has returned to the room, weeping uncontrollably. I am completely confused. I take the baby to comfort him, and I hold her in my other arm. She cries and weeps for the next, however many minutes, until the men arrive. She departs shortly thereafter. Her husband is absolutely invigorated, and my friend is quite obviously shook. Turns out, they were driving on the road back when the lightning struck the ground directly next to their vehicle, scaring my friend half to death. The strange part, though, was that while the drive took less than 3 minutes, the time between the lightning strike and their arrival was at least 20 minutes. After the neighbor family departs, my friend is ready to go. Go, right now. After arriving home and checking in with one another, we had done so. He tells me he loves me, but he will never go out there again. At the time, I thought maybe he was just really freaked out by that freak storm, and it would pass. He never would come back, and in fact, our relationship took a nosedive after this. Fast forward to moving in time. I've got all my stuff in place, and my dog, rabbit, and cat seem very content to have places to play. I was feeling so good that this was my ticket. I had a bonfire soon after and burned all those items I'd kept when cleaning the house. It just felt right to let them go ceremonially. The first night I had a nightmare. It was the worst nightmare I had experienced in many years. I kept waking up and falling right back in. Each waking, I awoke screaming. I know, it sounds dramatic. It was. Dream. This dream took place entirely at this new place. I was so afraid. No one would help me. There was one of the teen boys curled up in the corner wearing flower-patterned swim shorts or something similar. He wouldn't answer my pleas. I kept peeking out windows into the blackness, knowing there was something outside. I finally summoned the courage to open the door. On the doorstep were snakes. Green snakes twisted around one another. I screamed for someone to call the neighbor, and he needed to bring a gun. He arrives and gets out of his truck with a shovel and a nonchalant way about him. End dream. The nightmare left me a little on edge, as when I have nightmares, I'm typically under stress, and I didn't feel stressed in the least. 2 days later I am lounging in my hammock enjoying the sun and watching the rabbit and the cat play in the fenced area while the pup is sniffing about outside looking for treasures. I hear a very loud noise near the dog, and simultaneously the dog jumps back. I go to investigate, and there's a damn rattlesnake right outside the fence. I have never in my life seen or heard one, for that matter. I decide I have to take care of it because of the cat's and rabbit's safety. I know there's a pellet gun inside that might do the trick. I stare at this snake a moment longer. It looks weird. That's when I see the second head. Never have I seen one rattlesnake in my years of life, but here I am staring at two all entangled together. I immediately decide this job is above my pay grade, and I call the neighbor over and ask him to bring a gun. A few moments pass, and he arrives. The moment he exits the truck, I flash back to my nightmare, and my breath just caught in my throat. He exits the vehicle with a shovel and a sardonic grin. His teen exits as well, wearing the exact shorts I had dreamt of. He was uninterested in being there, so he was quiet. He dispatched both snakes, noting to me how dangerous it may be for me to live here without a gun. His tone and look made my skin crawl. As time went on, the nightmares grew worse but were always at the property. I would wake up screaming multiple times per night. In my nightmares, I would scream bruja, a word I had never used in my life, but it was now a frequent visitor inside my mind's eye. The dreams shifted to images of something dark and slimy. I can't describe what it looked like, but I knew its texture, in the back room. The back room was vacant because after moving in, I had felt increasingly uneasy in that space. I couldn't go near it in the dark without feeling fear so deep I wanted to vomit. The neighbors around me became increasingly rude and seemed to be making a point to make me feel unwanted. I finally got to the point. I was terrified to be there and was so sleep deprived I called on a shaman to come visit me to help me bless and clear whatever weird things were hanging on. She asked me what exactly was happening that made me feel I needed an outsider. I told her. She asked me where it was. I told her. She was quiet. She told me no. She would not visit, and it was her advice that I leave immediately. I wasn't ready to give up that easily and told her no. I would not be chased away. I reached out to 2 women who consented to conduct a cleansing ritual for me. During this process, we walked around the yard until we reached the bonfire ring, at which point she abruptly stopped. "What did you burn?" I was kind of taken aback at her tone, but I told her, and she said, "You shouldn't have done that." Directly thereafter, she informs me she needs to leave. I never heard from her again. I became increasingly isolated, as anyone who visited me wouldn't revisit me. My dear friends explicitly stated that they felt uncomfortable in the area. I began to wake up at night between 1 and 3 a.m. every single morning. One of those times I woke to a deep male voice, saying words I could not discern. I heard a woman's voice speaking in a language I couldn't understand. Once more, A deep male voice said, "I'm not ready yet." These incidents left me feeling crazy. There had to be an explanation. There had to be a reason. This is where I should say my belief in the paranormal was tested, and I realized I don't think I had ever really believed. One morning I feel myself wake, but I do not open my eyes, and I say in my mind's voice, "No. I will not look at you." I drifted back to sleep. I was suddenly awoken. This time it felt like I had a fever. My body was so hot, and my mind's voice said, "It's time to wake up." I glance at my phone, and it's 2:30 a.m. I downloaded a sleep recorder, because why not? And what I captured was a thing. The most distinguishable was a woman's voice, saying, "Come home." Another was singing in the far distance. A woman's voice was screaming, "Shut up." In true no evidence style, I deleted that app as soon as I moved. It was around this time I started seeing the thing in my peripheral vision in the kitchen. My dog would growl at windows in the darkness and wake up barking often throughout the entire duration. She was aggressive to every single neighbor and my landlord, but no one else. I'm curious to see what the community has to say about this issue and admittedly a little nervous. This entire experience tested what I believe. I'm not sure if this is a timeline shift or some sort of full-on wormhole/dimensional shit we experienced, but a few years back my family and I were heading down to Houston from Fort Worth. The exit we needed to get off at was the only way to get to the route we were taking. It was called Matlock, if I recall. A few miles before that, we saw the upcoming exit sign for Waxahachie. We all remember my mom pronouncing it weird to keep us entertained. In what felt like an instant afterwards, my mom asked my dad when Matlock is coming up. My dad looks around, and we notice that we are now way past where Matlock and we were supposed to be. This freaked us out. Despite being awake, my brother and I were unable to spot the Matlock exit. No one could have missed it. It all felt really weird to us. My mom explained it as being plucked from our location and being moved way far ahead. We, as Catholics, deemed it a form of divine intervention, but typing about this event gives me chills. I was skeptical until I experienced this today, a creek glitch. I was out hiking this dry creek near my house, just following along the rocks, looking for fossils, and chilling out. I usually run when it has rained a lot, but it was dry except for a few puddles here and there. The creek runs along our field, so when I reach the end of the property, I leave the creek bed and do a loop to where I first entered the creek. On my way there I heard what sounded like running water. I thought it was the wind in the trees. Initially, when I saw the creek, it didn't register that it was strange, but the spot I had just walked through was now running with water. I got to thinking for a bit and ran back down the stream to see the head of the water rushing down the dry creek bed, as if we just had a huge flood, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The creek was fed by two different streams, both were dry at the spot where they connected, and they are fed by springs less than a mile away but in separate directions. So it couldn't have been some kid damming up the creek and suddenly releasing it. It really couldn't have been anything I can think of, since it would have had to happen to both streams at once. Which is why this is so puzzling. I've investigated and run through all possible scenarios. There may have been some sort of underground water cave collapse or something, perhaps, but to the observer above ground, nothing seems different. It's as if the water was turned off and then turned on in different streams, with no apparent cause. It just suddenly appeared. Portal, dimensional shift, ghost? Last night, I was walking on a beach on the shores of Lake Ontario in Toronto, Canada, just after sunset. The light continues to shine for an additional 20 minutes, possibly even 17 more. My friend and I decided to keep walking to the end of a point to get another vantage of the skyline. As we were walking, we came across what looked like a door or a rough table with chrome legs anchoring it to the sand, maybe 3 feet below the water surface. There is a young woman sitting at the end closest to the shore. She is wearing a summer dress that appears to be made of linen. She has blondish-brownish hair, but I didn't see her face. She sat there with one leg crossed, the other leg dangling in the water. I'm still thinking, wow, this is weird but really cool. As we get closer, Buddy is looking concerned. Hypnotized, and I am looking towards her, and I say something like, "Hey, that's really groovy." We were sort of locked on, and for whatever reason, we seemed less creepy saying hi. It is at this point that this sub comes into play. And I also realize this is not anything I can explain to myself or easily get answers about. The woman now has black hair and has moved down the door with no discernible face, but she is holding a tech device with a screen, which is now illuminating her. The woman's demeanor abruptly changed from cool to intimidating. This is the most scared I have ever been with no rational reason other than instinct. So the scene, people are nearby on the beach, one guy passed us walking the other way and didn't acknowledge her or think it was odd. There was a boat maybe 20 meters away, and they weren't affected by what shook out next either. A curtain of thick vapor rolled into the shore. The air temperature was 27 degrees Celsius just seconds earlier, but now it feels as cool as a produce fridge. You could still read a book in the disappearing sunlight, but not anymore. Columns of dark blue and black vapor were whirling around the affected area. The area was maybe 20 meters along the shore, and very high above. It could have been 100 meters to 13.8 billion light years, and it was not that far out into the water, maybe 30 meters. Although it was dusk on the other side of this affected area and in the direction I was running, the door where these vapors were descending was darker than night. The darkness was so dense that hardly any light could penetrate it. The flashlight on the phone was garbage. Toronto is a vibrant city with bright lights downtown, and the reflections on the water seemed to blot out all light. So I grabbed Buddy's hand, who was standing still with a dropped jaw and bugged out eyes, and I yelled, "Run!" It was crazy instant horror movie vibes or Lynch shooting a film with no permit. The black-blue vapor combo circled the entity on the door. She basically diffused, as did the door with the chrome Art Deco legs. We watched it go down from afar, but we had to run past it to leave because this and another parallel trail provided the only escape. To give context of time, 1 minute 3 seconds seeing the woman on the door approaching on the beach. I spent 20 seconds stopped beside her, 13 seconds speaking to her with no response, and 7 seconds walking away looking back before my entire view of reality was forever changed. So what the hell was this? My abduction story. I'm very nervous to share this, but I think it's time to share my story. I've been following the drone activity in NJ and the increasing UFO sightings around the world. I don't know if I'll have a chance in the future. I was 8 years old when the incident happened. It was the middle of the night, and I woke up to use the bathroom. As I walked down the hallway, I suddenly felt an invisible force pulling me backward. It was like walking into a wall of plastic wrap. Every inch of my body was being pushed back, and I couldn't fight it. I blacked out for a few seconds, and when I came to, I was floating up toward the ceiling. There was a bright light surrounding me, but I could still see darkness all around me. It felt like the light was focused directly on me, while everything else beyond it disappeared into shadows. I tried to move or make sense of what was happening, but before I could, I blacked out again. At some point, I saw white mice. I'm not sure where I was or how they appeared, but I remember them clearly. I think I saw them while I was being moved to the room I ended up in, but my memory is very foggy. The next thing I remember, I was in a strange room. My wrists and ankles were bound to a chair, but it wasn't a normal chair. It felt like the chair was part of the floor, molded into it. The entire room had this silvery look to it, but what stood out the most were the veins of gold light running through the walls. The walls weren't smooth. They had a textured, almost stone-like surface, but it wasn't stone. The veins of light were embedded within them, glowing in uneven patterns. They branched out like the veins on a leaf or the lines in marble, but they weren't still. The light pulsed, getting brighter every few seconds before dimming again. With each pulse, I could hear a faint whooshing or humming sound, almost like the room was alive. The room was large, about the size of an elementary school gymnasium. Straight ahead of me was a large window. It didn't look like regular glass. It was more like liquid, constantly rippling and shimmering. The surface had a gray, metallic look, almost like mercury, and while it seemed solid, it was always moving. Behind the window, I could see shadowy figures. I couldn't make out any details, just dark shapes moving back and forth. The shadows weren't clear enough to tell what they looked like. It was as if they were observing me and wouldn't allow me to see them. After the abduction, I woke up in my hallway as if no time had passed. It was as if everything had been a dream, but I knew it wasn't. I ran into my parents' room, screaming, "The aliens are trying to get me." They calmed me down, and I eventually fell asleep between them, feeling safe. My mom still talks about how terrified I was of aliens when I was younger. She says I had to sleep with them for a long time because of how scared I was. But the only memory I have is of that encounter. To this day, I'm still afraid to watch alien movies, and I sometimes get scared at night. I'm 36 now, but I feel like I still carry the weight of that fear. I feel like I have PTSD from it. Everyone I've told, including therapists, thinks that I experienced a traumatic event and created these memories to cope with the trauma. I entirely disagree with all of them. What do you think? My otherworldly house. I'm not sure how to preface this story, but here goes. I grew up in a small house in a small, salt-of-the-earth town. My father worked at a sawmill, and my mother was a secretary at a local high school. My father served 3 tours in Vietnam, so he was a tough man to get along with. He was a pretty abusive father, verbally and physically, with us kids and my mother. This definitely made the house feel overwhelmingly heavy. Even as a 5-year-old, I could tell that this house just wasn't quite a home. I'd wake up anxious, and I'd go to sleep equally anxious. My mom told me later in life that she threatened to leave him on numerous occasions, but her mom, my grandmother, told her that it would be a mistake. That my mother would be tearing our family apart. Grandma was divorced, and she felt like it messed up her kids, my aunts and uncles. We were by no means rich, but we also weren't poor. We had a small 3-bedroom house with a huge backyard. My twin brother and I shared a room. My older brother, of course, got his room. My parents were directly across the hall from me and my twin brother's bedroom. I can't say for sure if my house was haunted or if it was something otherworldly. What I mean is that I experienced both while living in this house. I can't remember anything of my life prior to my 5th birthday. The first memory I have is of being in a shoe store located in a mall in a neighboring town. I know it's not the most exciting memory, but it's genuinely my first. I know for sure that I had multiple memories before that, but when I turned 5, they just vanished. They were completely erased from my memory. I can vividly remember being 5 when we lived in this house. I swear, I felt like I was 5 for like 3 years, it seemed to last so long. I first experienced strange occurrences when I began kindergarten. I was always scared of nighttime. What kid isn't, right? Well, I wasn't just scared, I was terrified to close my eyes and go to sleep. Even with my twin brother in the room with me. I'd always hear noises outside my bedroom window and see flashes of light. I forgot to mention that my brother and I had bunk beds. He's getting the lower bunk since he was 30 minutes older. I had to sleep in the top bunk, the less desirable bunk. The top bunk was directly in line with the window, so any sort of movement or lights outside was directly in my line of vision. I was constantly getting sick while living in this house. I would constantly have nosebleeds, and vomiting was almost a daily occurrence for me. Family would tell me that it was my nerves, and as I mentioned earlier, my dad had never made this house feel like a home. My 2 brothers seemed relatively healthy in comparison to me. I was always miserable. I can remember walking down the hallway and just feeling overwhelmingly dizzy, and I'd fall to the floor. Again, not knowing much about the world and life, I felt this was just normal for a kindergarten kid. One instance I can remember was when I was having a vomiting spell, and I decided to drag a pillow and blanket to the hallway and just sleep on the carpet outside the guest bathroom so I wouldn't have to go very far the next time I had the urge to puke. My mom must have heard the commotion of me trying to lay out the blanket in a makeshift bed, and she came out of her room and invited me to sleep with her and my dad in their bed. I was in the middle of them and can recall how odd it was that my mom fell asleep almost as soon as her head hit the pillow while I lay there for what seemed like forever to fall asleep. I just stared at their dresser that was at the foot of their bed. They had a small black and white television that sat on it. Next to it were a few small photos of family trips and relatives that had since passed away before I was even born. Something drew my attention from that dresser for just a split second, but as soon as I looked away, I was back to staring at that point in the room. But this time there was one more item in my line of vision, a tall, opaque figure just hovering above the ground, looking directly at me. It wasn't solid, and it wasn't see-through. I could make out the shapes of the TV and the pictures on the dark dresser behind it. It didn't have eyes but had black sockets where eyes should be, and they were directly gazing at me. It had no nose or mouth. It seemed like it was studying me. It wasn't moving towards me or motioning me or anything like that. It just sort of hovered off the ground, and I could tell because it bobbed up and down the way a buoy would bob in and out of a lake. I gawked at it for what seems like an eternity, but it must have only been a few moments. I buried my entire head under the blankets and got into the fetal position, trying to make myself as small as humanly possible. I know I couldn't see through blankets, but I knew it was still there. That heaviness that the house took on at night was so present at that moment that I thought I could scream, but my mouth just sat there agape with no sound coming out. I felt helpless lying in that bed, praying that one of my parents would wake up, but they seemed to be there. They didn't appear to be awake or asleep, they were simply there. This thing seemed to hold on to anything in that house it wanted, and we were subject to it. I finally mustered the courage to peek my head out from the covers, and just like that, it was gone. I could see clearly now the photos and the television on the dresser in the dim moonlight. The next experience wasn't quite as frightening as that one. Earlier I mentioned that my twin brother and I shared bunk beds and that I was on the top. Well, my dad put on a guardrail on the side of my bed because one night, I fell off the bed. I was drawn to something on the floor in the darkness. I don't know whether it was a toy or some piece of garbage my brother or I had left on the floor earlier that day. I know there was a copious amount of trash and toys on the floor. There wasn't more than 1 foot of actual carpet without there being said garbage or toy in the way, and how I didn't get hurt is beyond me. I remember it seemed like I had been pulled off the bed in slow motion, and I could feel myself falling, but I couldn't see it. I felt as if I was slowly being carried off the bed and placed safely on the floor. I missed landing on all the sharp plastic toys and missed landing on any candy wrappers or any other trash that was on the floor at the time. I didn't hit the ground with a thud either. I remember waiting for the painful moment that my small body would make contact with the earth, but it didn't happen that way. Instead, I felt like I had landed on a cloud. Something so soft that I can't describe it. After a few moments of shock that I was still alive and had no visible injuries, I slowly and quietly ascended my ladder to the top bunk and crawled back into bed. I fell asleep peacefully and quickly that night. A third memory that I can recall is not terrifying at all but completely absurd to me even to this day. I crawled into my top bunk just like I did hundreds of times when I lived in that house. I wasn't overly exhausted, sad, or anything out of the ordinary, so I can't chalk it up to being a tired 5-year-old. I put my head down on my pillow and got ready for sleep. I blinked, and it was daytime. I know what you're thinking. You just slept well that night. Oh no, that's not it. I felt as though I had blinked my eyes a million times in my life. I shot up in bed and looked out the window, and it was daytime. Didn't have that just woken up feeling or the heavy eyelids that accompany waking up. I was as fresh as when I first put my head on the pillow. I stopped sharing that memory with people because I get strange looks and recommendations from these wannabe sleep experts about what may have happened that night. But I assure you, I was not even fatigued when I placed my head down and blinked. I didn't shut my eyes for the night, I literally just blinked my eyes, and the night was over. Completely done with. I have no idea what could have happened. I tell you one thing. If it was just a great night's sleep, I haven't had one of those sleeps ever since. On a side note, my dad has just revealed to me that when he was a young boy walking down his family's cotton fields at night, he heard a strange noise and saw bright lights in the sky. He thought maybe it was a helicopter and that he'd get into trouble for walking the fields at night, so he hid under a large cotton bush, and the object hovered above him with its light panning around him when suddenly it just shot off at a ridiculous speed and angle. Years later, when he enlisted in the army, he asked one of his superiors if we had anything that resembled what he saw that night, and his lieutenant said that this sort of technology just didn't exist at the time. The time being the mid to late 1960s. Perhaps we have a shared history with something beyond this world. That's pretty much my story. If anybody has ever been exposed to anything similar to this, I'd appreciate a little feedback. Until then, I guess my childhood was just shrouded in mystery. Disappearing Valley. Back in the 70s and early 80s, my aunt lived in a small town near Fort Worth, Texas, and at the far back of her property were train tracks that were still in use. Being boys, of course, we were always hanging out around the tracks at a small bridge that ran over a creek. It was always freaky because it was a wooden bridge and creaked and groaned loudly when a train would pass over. Okay, so early one morning, I and 2 cousins were down at the bridge, and we decided to explore more of the creek. We slowly made our way along the bank, and a short distance from the tracks, we found a fork in the creek and followed it. And this is where it gets freaky for me. The fork led to a massive canyon/valley. We could see the cliff walls and trees, even a waterfall complete with mist, and it was unlike anything we had ever seen in that area. My description doesn't do it justice, but we were in absolute awe, and since it was obvious we could go no further down that fork, we soon left to explore more of the creek. It was maybe 30 to 45 minutes before we made our way back, and we all wanted one last look at the valley, but the fork was gone. Of course, the valley was also gone. We walked up and down the creek trying to see where we missed it, but no go, it was gone. This valley has stayed on my mind for years, and a few weeks ago I was moved to do some research on the area, and to my shock and dismay, maps shows a road through that specific area, and there are no signs of train tracks anywhere near that area. I know they may have pulled up the tracks to build a new road, but even the unimproved areas are slightly off geographically and have no tracks. My aunt remembers the tracks, and one of the cousins does remember events exactly as I do, but his brother, who is a few years older than us, wouldn't even discuss it and got visibly angry when I kept trying to bring up the subject. No idea what it was, but it certainly wasn't a mirage or reflection. It was in vivid detail and definitely some sort of glitch.